I'd like to welcome everyone to the first AIME history session that I'm aware of that we've given. This is something, I've said I was going to do this for about the last 3 or 4 years, and finally I decided, hey, I have to do this. And so I put out a call for papers. I included this in the schedule, and I figured, boy, I'm going to have trouble getting papers. And I made a couple calls. I wanted to make sure Dick was giving a paper, and Mike, and lo and behold, the next thing I know, I had 8 papers that came in, and I was really pleased. I've gotten a lot of feedback from people that want to know, are we going to do this on a regular basis? And so I'll tell you right now, my intent is to have a mining history session once again in Phoenix next year as well. So the attendance here is really good. I'm pleased. We've asked to record this, so we do have these talks. I don't think I don't know if any of them are pre-printed, but that way we'll also have them available that way. It was a very diverse group of papers. First, let me introduce myself. I'm George Luxbacher. I am the Deputy Associate Director for Mining at NIOSH, and so obviously my paper here has nothing to do with mining research. It's mining history. This has been a passion of mine. I was the 2008 president of SME, the 2012 president of AIME, and I think I'm in line to be the 2021 president of AIME once again. That'll be the 150th anniversary of AIME, and we'll be celebrating that in Wilkes-Barre in May of that year. So just you may want to mark that on your calendar if you're interested. We're not going to do a big to-do, but I think we're going to do definitely some history-related things for that 150th anniversary. So I think it'll be very interesting. The papers are up here just to throw up a quick slide to tell you that our presenters here today, Dick Bullock will be presenting, and Dick has a little brochure I saw back there for volume 1 of his book. And they tell me volume 2 is coming out here shortly, Dick? I heard volume 2 was coming out shortly?
Yeah, in
April. So volume 2 will be out in April. I think quite a few of us in here have already read volume 1 of Dick's autobiography. It was very interesting. Matter of fact, when we come to introduce Dick, I'm not going to introduce Dick. I'm going to tell you, buy his book, read the book, then you'll know who Dick is. Now, we'll have some paper. We'll have a presentation from Crystal Hocking from RESPEC. RESPEC puts out a series of mining history books, primarily related to salt mining. I don't know if she was going to plug those, but I'll put a plug up. And then the third plug here is for the Mining History Association. Mike will be our last speaker. Mike is the webmaster and one of the key people involved with the Mining History Association. So I encourage you also to look at their website. While I guess the majority of their members, Mike, are all professional historians.
It's about 50-50.
50-50.
We started with a bunch of Western history professors back about 25 years, 30 years ago, but it's now about split. So we have about half folks that are from the industry and mining professionals,
Okay.
and we're trying to keep the historians honest.
Okay. It's if you go to their website, they put the back issues of their magazine out on the website. So it's a tremendous resource to go back to. So I think we're going to, let's see, I wanted to go back to that. So anyhow, we have a number of papers here. We have 7 papers. My 8th paper, Mike Korb, when Mike realized that I didn't have any problem getting papers, Mike said, you know, I really don't want to come to Denver and freeze. He's up in Pennsylvania. He was happy to stay up in Pennsylvania, so he elected not to come. I'm sure he'll be here for next year since we'll be in Phoenix, so I anticipate I'll have a paper from Mike next year. But we have 7 papers. I'm not going to worry. I've told the presenters that if we run over a little bit on time, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm not going to put time in here per se for questions. If you have questions, we'll try to squeeze them in. But I'd really rather hear from the presenters and get some great talks rather than spend a lot of time with questions. So, like I say, this time's going to flex a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised at all to find out we go 15, 20 minutes after the end of the session. I hope everybody bears with us. I think it's going to be well worth the time. So with that, very first person to introduce is Isabella Barton. Isabella's an assistant professor in mining. She was a professor of practice for a while, right? And then you moved, or researcher, and then she just recently moved over as an assistant professor. So she has, I've known Elizabeth for quite a while, and I'm looking forward to hearing her paper here. So you get to kick us off. Let me bring you up here. Let's see how we do this. Come on. There we go. Take this down. I got them all nicely labeled.
Oh, that's good.
So here we go.
Hey, thanks, George. Can everybody hear me in the back? All right, well, first thing I have to say is thank you, George, for putting this all together. Second thing I have to say is that you're going to regret saying it was okay to run over, because I have a couple of students here in the back, and they can tell you I will. However, I hope it's going to be interesting the whole time. So I'm here to talk today about the origins of the mining and metallurgy literature, which is something that happened in early modern period in European history. And of course, everybody knows about Georgius Agricola, and not as many people are familiar with the events leading up to Agricola or what followed. So I'm hoping to give a little bit more of that picture here. And the central question here is really, why did it happen then and why in Europe? And so in order to address that, I'm going to be going through a little bit of context and then kind of narrate the development of the literature and then go back and analyze and return to that central question. Now, the reason why the central question is why in Europe and why then is that would have been about the least likely place for it to happen. It's difficult for us today to assess this really, but at that point in human history, around 1450 AD, Europe wasn't exactly a backwater in terms of mining, but it was pretty near the bottom of the list of likely places to produce a massive efflorescence of technical literature on a new subject. So just to set the stage, that time, metal supply was much lower, obviously, than it is today. Metals were scarce, and even the relatively low-value ones like lead and iron could be traded for fairly long distances. For gold and silver, of course, they traveled the globe. The primary gold source region at the time was West Africa, where you can see the King of Mali here, displaying an awful lot of gold. Okay, there we go. And there's a reason that I'm not on the technological end of engineering. Anyway, so the major source regions for gold, silver, and some of the other metals were dominantly outside of Europe. And Europe at the time did have a good deal of mining, mainly for local use, but production was fairly low compared to other places. They were not at the forefront of technology, and they had, at that point, had no real history of research since the Roman period. And if you were going to look at the regions of the earth that might have produced a sudden flowering of technical literature, you would have figured that China had already invented printing and they were at the forefront of technology. East Africa had the deepest mines. The place with the longest history and most interest in technical literature was the Muslim world. Europe probably wouldn't even have been on the list. And yet, when we fast forward 150 years, we find these 5 and many other books that have been written about mining and metallurgy, even though the global mining and trade situation had changed primarily only by the addition of the New World as a source region. Otherwise, China was still the major producer for a lot of metals. Africa still dominated the world's gold supply and so on. But we now have Germany especially, but in general continental Europe, as the center of mining expertise and metallurgical technology and research. And so that really is the question, what changed that allowed that to happen? So let's start by taking a look at the situation in the later 1400s AD in Europe. So everybody is probably familiar with the Black Death of the mid-1300s. That was only one of a series of plagues that reduced the European population by possibly up to a third or a half. Added to which, that clearly wasn't enough problem already, so there were a number of wars, the Hussite Wars, the Wars of the Roses, the 100 Years' War, which is shown in the picture there. And that caused a massive labor shortage. In general, population decreased significantly. There was a definite shortage of labor, and there started to be some shifts in labor relations where workers had previously been more or less tied down to the land. They started to move around. In some cases, they started to negotiate, and you saw the beginnings of an early capitalist system in the place of feudalism. On the mining side and on the monetary side, there was also a massive shortage of currency metals at this time. It's referred to, I think, as the Great Bullion Famine or the Great Silver Famine, and it peaked around 1400 to 1425. It was caused partly by low production, partly by monetary policies and trade relations that effectively sucked metals out of Europe and sent them east and south. Shallow ores had at that time been mined out. There was more down there, but it was largely inaccessible with the present technology. And unlike some other places in the world, the population density was still high enough and land ownership such that there weren't very many undiscovered surface deposits hanging out there. So that was really the situation in the political and social sense. Technologically, this imposed a few requirements that then showed up in the mining industry. So mining operations couldn't really spread out, so they had no choice but to go down. They got bigger and they got deeper. And when you're digging below the water table, water suddenly becomes an issue. You start having to add more ground support, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, this meant that mining went from being a dominantly mom and pop backyard part-time operation to a full-time skilled career that required a good deal of capital investment. And that triggered a number of different developments that we'll talk about a bit later. The second feature at this point is that independent markets for base metals started to develop. So back, for instance, in the Roman period and through most of the Dark Ages, most base metals were produced largely as a byproduct of silver mining. Silver was the major currency throughout the Roman world, and usually they produced lead and copper because they really didn't have a choice. They had to produce that to get the silver out. But the development, for instance, of cannon was the major spur for independent markets in copper and in tin. Around this time, they also started to use lead to seal roofs and windows, and basically base metals became a commodity in their own right, not just a byproduct that you can try and sell for a few bucks. There were a series of new inventions. Cupellation dates from roughly 1451, the printing press, of course, around the same time, and the earliest blast furnaces date from the end of that century, as well as a little bit more of the rediscovery of mining technology that had been lost with the Romans. And of course, shortly after the printing press was invented, there started to be a massive number of books printed, about 30,000 in the 50 years ending the 1400s. Of those, basically 0 were on mining and metallurgy, despite all of this new technology. But as we'll see, these changes really laid the foundation for the printing that did happen in the 1500s. So just to summarize our last few points, mining at this point had become corporate and it had become technical. Your previous subsistence model where you had farmers just going off and digging a little bit of silver and during the farming off season had gone out the window, and it was replaced by organized full-time 24 hours a day mining. And this required a lot more capital, and capital was not usually had by the same people who wanted to do the digging. So in short, the investor was invented. And that, as we'll see, was really the stimulus for the development of the literature. So we're about to go on a tour of that literature, and that can get a little bit confusing at times. So I put a little chart up here to guide us through the evolution. Now let me see if I can figure out which of these is, that's not the laser pointer. Okay, here we go. Sorry, one more time. Here we go. So we started from a literature that had developed really in the later Roman period. A lot of it was alchemical, and then there were things called lapidaries, which I'll introduce briefly. But basically they were concentrating on the physical and then primarily the metaphysical properties of stones. There was really nothing about mining, metallurgy, or chemistry in there, and they were invariably written in Latin or Greek. The early works that we're going to examine in the late early 1500s retained a lot of that. We'll explain the illustration later, but they started to mix in a little bit of practical advice on how to find and mine and smelt ores. That kept on developing. Eventually we dropped the metaphysics and we went full bore on the technical end of the literature, and that finally developed into what we would recognize today as the early scientific works of the 16 and 1700s. And so just kind of keep this arc in mind as we start going through the time cycle here. So let's talk about our starting point. So back in the Greek and Roman period, there was a fair bit of work on the earth, but it was mainly in the context of being one of the 4 Aristotelian elements. There was only one ancient philosopher or writer who appears to have actually had a rock collection or to have set foot in a mine. That was Theophrastus. He was one of Aristotle's students. Unfortunately, the entire book he wrote called On Mines has been lost. On fragments of his other one, On Stones, survives. Pliny and Seneca both wrote about mines largely from the point of view of the armchair. And then, in part their work, but partly a bunch of folk traditions, gave rise to the alchemical corpus, one example of which is shown on the right there. That's what passes for a technical illustration in one of the many, many manuals for transmuting lead into precious metals. And as you can tell from the illustration, this placed the emphasis on getting the right conjunction of the astronomical bodies and making the right incantations to the appropriate occult spirits in order to effect this metallurgical operation. Interestingly, as a side note, at the time, metals and minerals were regarded as organic. People thought that a plant is just a slow-moving animal, and they figured a rock was just a slow-moving plant. And in fact, there are historical records of the periodic closures of stone quarries and iron mines by the Romans to allow the ore to regrow back after mining had, so to speak, pruned it. Anyway, the technical parts of these were definitely not intended for people who were actually trying to go out and dig up some ore and smelt it. They were more about ennobling your mind through studying metaphysics. Okay, the lapidary literature deserves some examination because it was still going in full force in the early 1500s when we get to the period that we're examining. So this is one of the late examples. It's called Speculum Lapidum, which means the mirror of stones. A mirror was actually a literary genre in the medieval period. It meant sort of holding up a mirror to something to show its features. And this one was by Camille Leonardi in 1502. He was an Italian doctor. Actually, he was the court physician to Cesare Borgia, to whom the work is dedicated. If anybody knew about a few of the more pernicious properties of minerals, that probably would have been him. It is, once again, it's mainly an alphabetical list of 270-some minerals with a description of their occurrence and their properties and their metaphysical powers. And it was another one of those that was designed definitely for somebody who wasn't actually trying to deal with rocks on a practical basis. It was more for the curious person who wanted to be edified without the trouble of leaving his armchair. It's unillustrated, and I'm afraid I'm rather harsh at the bottom there, but it really is practically useless from a mining perspective. So in the first years of the 1500s, the printing press produced a couple of books that started to depart from this. The Probierbuchlein was a series of sort of assay manuals that had started coming out in the 1480s and continued into the 1510s. The authors are anonymous and probably multiple. And these were basically cookbooks for assaying. It means a little book of assaying. And then there's the Nützliche Bergbuchlein, or the New Booklet of Mining, loosely speaking. That came out in around 1505 and was written by the rather scholarly mayor of Freiburg. And this is one of his illustrations. It shows a vein in the hillside here which is emitting a mineralizing vapor. And the Neutzlich Bergbuch line is one of the first of these works that actually focuses on how to tackle mining in practical terms. So instead of just listing all the metaphysical properties, which he still does, he focuses on how do you go out and prospect. And a lot of the advice still has to do with find the south-facing slopes because that's where the astral influences are strongest. But it's at least an attempt, and in fact sometimes quite a good one, to tackle the practical problems of mining. Later in the early 1500s, we started to get even more practical. These are a couple of works that were not strictly aimed at mining. One of them was about metallurgy. It's actually called Alchemy and Mining. It was one of a series of 4 books focused on how to carry out the chemical operations of metallurgy in such a way as to attain the desired material characteristics on both the physical and the spiritual levels. And The Origin of Common Mining Laws, which is the second one, there is a compilation of German and Norwegian mining texts, some of which actually are thought to date back to the 1300s. And these have absolutely nothing to do with metaphysics, and it's all about who owns what part of the vein, whose drainage tunnel may not interfere with another's, how the landowner is supposed to be paid, and so on. All right, 1540 was really where the last bit of metaphysics more or less departed from the mining literature. And this one was written by an Italian metallurgist, Vannucci Biringuccio. It's called On Pyrotechnology. And this is also the point where the philosophical justification for a gentleman trying to improve his mind exits the literature. So all of the earlier works had tried to say something about how the mining was a part of the pursuit of knowledge that ennobled the human spirit. Biringuccio commented that while spiritual enlightenment was great, he was writing this book to show people how to make a quick buck in a profession that, as he put it, was less risky than being a soldier. And he also started putting the technical illustrations on a really detailed, accurate basis. If you look at his furnace and the bellows operations on the right there, you can definitely start to see the shift away from the mineralizing vapor coming out of the hill and towards what we would recognize as a modern scientific illustration. And he focused rigorously on stuff that he knew worked. And when he mentions alchemy, it's usually only to talk about how it doesn't work, which Biringuccio knew well, having spent most of his early career attempting to turn lead into gold. But you can see in the Pyrotechnia the first real attempt at creating standardized measures and standardized metallurgical operations for different ore types. And it was quite clear that by that point, even though he really didn't have or didn't express any hypotheses about what was really going on, he understood the mechanical operations of smelting quite well. All right, so now we get to Georgius Agricola, everybody's favorite. He was a German doctor who was widely traveled but eventually settled on the Czech-German border and spent 20 or 30 years writing close to a dozen books on everything from geology, hydrology, and mining to Greek and Latin grammar. And of course, his opus magnum was De Re Metallica, which was published a year after he died in 1555. And one of the reasons that De Re Metallica was posthumously published was that Agricola was so nitpicky about the detail and accuracy of his woodcuts that he nearly drove the printer nuts. But he got very good technical illustrations out of it, and so you can see the people doing the dewatering here are nicely illustrated, and the illustration is technically correct. One thing to point out here, you might be able to see these in the front, but these small objects down there, as well as a good deal other the pictures, have letters on them, and those letters corresponded to labels that were given in the caption. And so we've moved away from Biringuccio simply being accurate to Agricola trying to maximize the potential of the technical illustration in order to transmit information about how things worked. And Agricola's work was largely based on, well, one, Biringuccio. He adapted, which is a euphemism for lifted, several parts of the Pyrotechnia. But he also used his own eyes and his own experience, and he talked a lot with miners. And his work evolves from, it's kind of like the history of the whole literature in microcosm. He starts out with Aristotle's hypotheses on the origins of water flow in the subsurface, and his technical books from the early period consist largely of these gentlemanly philosophical discussions. But it evolved over time into this very observation-based, practical style of work. However, it's interesting that he never stopped writing in Latin. And this actually was the first of the mining books in this period to be written in Latin. All of the others had been in vernacular, including the Berenbuch line and the Pyrotechnia. And that was largely because Agricola thought that it was high time that this mining literature, which had existed on the fringes of respectability for a long time, should receive a proper scholarly format. So it was, in essence, his attempt to make it legitimate in the eyes of scholarship as a genuine focus for research. All right, I'm not even going to try the title up there. You're welcome to if you'd like, but it's The Treatise on Ores and Assaying by Lazarus Erker. It's published in 1574, and this was sort of like Agricola for metallurgists, and specifically for assayers. It's a lot like Biringuccio in that he uses very detailed technical illustrations and goes through a number of clearly very well understood quantitative chemical procedures, but he makes absolutely no effort at the theoretical principles underpinning them. Incidentally, Erker used his own assay lab as an example, and his estimate for their weekly throughput was about 200 assays every week. So you can get an idea of the production as well as of his own experience from that. All right, moving on to the mining literature after the 1600s, there were a few new books, and I've put them up there, in mining and metallurgy. In ore deposit geology, Georgius Agricola had the last word for a little over 3 centuries, until Pasepni started to write. Mineralogy actually took off in a big way, and part of it evolved out of the ore deposits literature, where they eventually they kept on studying minerals, and that eventually gave rise first to descriptive mineralogy and then to theoretical mineralogy. And despite the slowdown in what you might call the academic literature, Central Europe was the global hub for mining education. German miners went everywhere to practice their trade, and other nations were sending people to be educated in the German mining schools. So to recap where we started from, we started out with lots of alchemy but no practical use. Then we got alchemy plus practical utility. Then we left alchemy by the by and sort of went back to just being practical. And that continued up until a very late period. And so it's more or less outlined in the text there. And the question that we finally come back to is why that happened. And it happened because, in essence, the 1500s in Europe were a very unique place in regard to mining. They had these technical challenges. They needed more metal. They were desperately short of it, but they couldn't really go out and discover new deposits. All they could do was go deeper with the ones they had. That required a lot of technical skill, and it required lots and lots of capital. And so the people who were putting in the capital generally knew nada about mining, but they didn't want to be scammed. And so this literature arose in large part to inform them. And they didn't have a lot of patience with metaphysics, which is why I think in the early part of the 1500s, you see the metaphysics slowly dropping out and everyone frankly admitting that it's all about money and let's go with what works. And later on, the scholarly literature, as we've seen, this gave rise to genuine scholarly works such as the early texts on mineralogy. It also gave rise to its own class of works that were written by and for people who were mining or running smelters and who needed a kind of textbook or reference book. And this is really where mining literature reached what we would now call a modern form. We have different forms of communication. We have the pure research paper, and then we have the, okay, how do you smelt copper? And this was really the beginning of that divergence. And it all happened, again, just because there was a unique need in Europe at the time, and things like the printing press provided an opportunity to fill that need. All right, that was the end of my talk, and I'm not sure we actually have time for questions, but I'll leave that up to George.
One or two questions very quickly.
Riley?
So, why do you think that within Europe, this mostly happened in Germany when there were other areas like Cornwall and Spain that also had significant mines?
So a very good question. Why was it Germany and not most of the other places in Europe where they had mining? The answer is I'm not entirely sure. I think a lot of it may have to do with social events elsewhere. Germany at this period was at least intermittently at peace until the religious wars after the Reformation kicked off. In England, they were still fighting things like the Wars of the Roses and everything that continued after that, and they had very different political and social situations. I think those may be connected, but the honest answer is I don't really have a lot to substantiate that at the moment.
Any other quick questions?
Okay, thanks, George.
One interesting aspect here, those of us that have been around the society for a long time remember when every new member of SME got a copy of De Re Metallica, Compliments of the Mud Fund. So I actually have my copy of De Re Metallica. It's actually one of the very first books I read because as a young college student, they handed us De Re Metallica. And so it's interesting. Okay, our next speaker here, let me bring up my, Okay, our next speaker here is Terry Braun from SRK. Terry's going to talk to us about Alaska gold and Southwest copper, but the key he's going to talk to us about is Jackling. And those in the M&E group know Jackling very well through the Jackling lectures and the Jackling medal. I have another, are you going to mention Jackling's house at all? Not this time. Okay, I'll just throw out then that Steve Jobs actually bought Jackling's house out in California and tore it down, despite the fact that there was a big push to keep it because it was historic. So just one of those little blurbs that I know about. But anyhow, so let me go ahead and do an introduction here. So Terry spent his youth wandering around the Silver Bow Basin up near Juneau, Alaska. He and his friends had no idea about the gold mining in that area that put Juneau on the map basically around 1880. As he's approaching his 30th year working in the mining industry, he recently rediscovered the mining history of his hometown. And in doing so, he found some interesting historical connection between his own work with the copper industry of today and the copper mining legend who built an extraordinary project in Juneau more than 100 years ago. So with that, we'll let Terry come up and talk.
All right, thank you. This is only 100 years old. It's not 500 years old, Isabel, so we are fast forwarding a little bit in the history timeline. But it is a story about Jackling, indeed, a well-known metallurgist. And it is, Jackling maybe have got you in the room, it may have certainly got my attention, but it's also a lesser-known mining engineer who worked with Jackling and actually helped put something which I call extraordinary into place right before World War I, something called the Alaska Gastonau Company. So, for those of you who do know Jackling from the lectures here, here's a quick review here that he came out of Missouri, he came out of Rolla, actually, around 1892. And he started his mining career actually just up the road here in Cripple Creek, about 2 hours drive from where we are now. In Cripple Creek, he did work with some other famous names here, but he really came up with cyanide and experimental mill designs and really a scientific, rigorous method about how he was trying to prove flow sheets and whether we could economically produce gold, in this case, from whatever ore he was provided. So About 1896, with some of the success he had in Cripple Creek, he went to Mercure, Utah, and he built a mill. A mill that's one of the first in Utah that used cyanide. It was one of the first in the world that actually used electrically powered equipment. Most of you know from about that time, things really picked up for Jackling. Right down the road, he went to Bingham Canyon, and at the time it was a deposit that a few were scratching around in some high-grade materials on. And Jackling had the sponsorship of from his Colorado connection to look at this and actually do one of the first resource estimates, I should say, of its kind. Churn drills, looking at things at depth. That's a long and very interesting story. I think what really counts in this story today is by 1903, he had put it together. And he put together what became the Utah Copper Company, made the El Pomar Foundation possible in Colorado Springs. It was one of the singular most extraordinary industrial achievements, I think, in mining or economic development in mining, was the start of the Utah Copper Corporation. You know, from there, with that low-grade, high-volume technology that he put together, he wasn't the first to invent any one piece of it, but he was one of the first to look at things with rigor and to build and test and make something work. So, from 1903 to 1915, he created what I would call the 4 primary parts of the Jackling Group, starting with Bingham Canyon, Chino Mines, Ray Mine, Nevada Consolidated. The first folks that backed Jackling and Utah Copper did extraordinarily well, as did Jackling. And big money saw a man who knew how to put systems and projects together and deliver value. Spectacular value. So, not only was he a smart guy from Missouri, maybe that was the show me state part of him, but he was someone who had a reputation for detailed organization, operational efficiency. He figured out, probably the key in his model there was you could process low grade, but you had to move it. You had to move a lot of it, and you had to move it efficiently through your system to recover, to be economic. And it was this philosophy, this mentality that he brought, this technology that he brought, that made big money, investors in the East Coast or Europe follow him. And it was in 1912 that big money took him to the Juneau Goldbelt. The Juneau Goldbelt is about 100 miles long. It's in southeast Alaska. And it starts more or less down in the right-hand side, Windham Bay on the south end, up to Berners Bay in the north. And over here on the left-hand side, you see these yellow arrows just sort of conceptually illustrating sort of the path of exploration. But after the 49ers went and did their job in California, we had gold rushes over in Australia, we had the bonanzas around the Fraser River Valley, and we had prospectors producing or pushing themselves north, looking for their, well, they knew it wasn't going to be easy, but looking for their gold mines. In this district as a whole, on the right-hand side, our roughly almost 7 million ounces of gold came out between 1881 and 1944, and about 3.1 million ounces of silver. Most of this didn't come from any of these small areas up or down on the gold belt. It came from right here. 3 large-scale projects, starting with the Treadwell mine. We'll talk a minute about those in a moment, a bit more in a moment. So, Juneau was discovered in 1880, or the gold in Juneau was discovered in 1880. And about 15 years later, once the Treadwell had gotten running, the Klondike gold rush took off, right? The Klondike gave us the quick rish, or this idea that you can become a millionaire. Just watch that first steamship come back with the guys who were lucky to have a couple pounds of gold in their bag, right? The quick, get rich quick. That was the Klondike dream. Miners who kind of got there and looked at Juneau and decided, you know what? I can actually earn a steady wage here in a growing community, and I can make a living in Juneau and maybe not go up the Klondike, up the Chilkoot Pass, right? So the average miner chose that, while the prospector, most of them came back broke. Average Juneau miner who started with Treadwell and actually carried on to this period of time we're talking about now, did quite well. Interesting about the rabbit and the hare analogy, perhaps. All right, in 1912, Jackling made his visit to Juneau, and with him came a fellow named Albert Holden. Not quite as famous as Jackling, but if you know your history, he was actually quite big in the early stages of U.S. mining and smelting, and in his day, he was also someone that was recognized by investors as with credibility that could help sort out the good from the bad and where their money should go. So both Jackling and Holden went through what was called the Perseverance Mine at the time. Nice name for a mine, don't you think? It's not quite the Hard Luck or the Irish Mag, but it's perseverance matters, right? And the guy that toured him was a fellow named Bart Thane. Bart Thane lived in Juneau, and he's our next slide. I'm going to talk about it a bit more, but let me tell you, he wasn't the money, and he wasn't the genius of Jackling, but he was sort of the vehicle that made this project come together. You don't hear about him. So, the money was Hayden and Stone. A lot of places out in the West are named after a guy named Hayden. That's why. Who was Bart Thane Hayden, and what was this project? 7 years younger than Jackling, Bart Thane came out of Berkeley. Berkeley had a school of mines, and it was extraordinary in the turn of the century. 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, it's a who's who of mining at the time. He graduated in 1899, and he started literally at the bottom of the shaft of the Sumdum mine, just 40 miles south of Juneau. He didn't stay there for long. He moved up the ranks. He worked through the Eagle River mine. He went through the Kensington mine, yes, the Kensington mine that we know about today, until he started to get a feel of where these smaller operations could be put together into a larger portfolio. And something about him and his background saw a way to persevere and to put together a claim block. It took a time because there was a bankruptcy involved, and there was anything takes time when you're trying to talk about this fractionalized ownership. It took several years until it was ready. He had his package for the bankers. Was it a bankable feasibility study, right? What we call today. Part of his strategy and his plan in 1912 was the success of the Treadwell mine, just across the Gastonau Channel, starting 1889 through 1922. The Alaska Juneau, right next door to him, you see the Gastonau claim block here, I illustrate on the right-hand side. You'll also see the Alaska Juneau, that 1917 to 1944. We'll go back to those dates in a minute, perhaps, but let me tell you this. If you were a Juneau resident at the time, or if you read a flyer in Seattle and said, where do I want to be in, maybe I don't want to be the miner, but where do I have an opportunity? Where is a long-term stable economic future? 3 hard rock gold mines, all within a mile of each other, basically, right across the channel. Juneau residents of that time were prepared for decades of growth, right? So, how did this company come together? Once Jackling had a look at the project and Albert Stone came back saying, it's a go, Charles Hayden of Hayden and Stone started to roll up the funds. First thing they needed to do was create a holding company, which they could use to list on the New York Stock Exchange. And the holding company looked like this. Hayden at the top, Daniel Jackling, VP, a guy named K.R. Babbitt as secretary. Both Hayden and Babbitt had followed Jackling on a few other projects, not the first, but were quick to recognize what he was capable of doing and were quick to say, let's get this company going. The Alaska Gold Company was the holding company for what was the reorganized Alaska Gastonau Mining Company. Bart Thane, the fellow we talked about from Berkeley, and Harry Wollenberg, chief engineer. Both Bart and Harry were actually classmates while at Berkeley. Their underground mine was led by a fellow named George T. Jackson, a lot of Georges in the story, George T. Jackling was responsible for handpicking the rest of this crowd. This is part of the theme of this talk. You see how Jackling's not only his organizational skills, but how he'd had technology transfer of bringing folks that were with him in Utah Copper, Chino Mines, Ray. All these fellas got trips, sometimes on Jackling's train up here. Let's talk about the owner's team. Inside of Alaska Gastonau, of course, we had Daniel Jackling as our vice president, Bart Thane as general manager. Both Jackling and Thane said, we've got to build this mine first. We've got, the Perseverance mine was an existing operation that had run for about 4 years before hard times, and basically money problems. And the vision was to bring that mine online, but not in the way it had been envisioned, or to basically increase the production immensely and to connect it to a large mill, which is what Jackling was bringing the technology for. So to do this, there were 3 divisions. Perseverance Division, the Sheep Creek Division, and the Salmon Creek Division. Perseverance Division was about the underground mine. This was sort of taking what was a 200-ton per day production to a 6,000-ton per day production. Big job for that group. We'll talk about that in a sec. The second main task of the Perseverance Division was to drive a 2-mile-long tunnel to connect from the inboard Silver Bowl Basin side through the mountain range to a tidewater site where Jackling's vision and Bart Thane's vision was to put a town, the mill, the retreatment facilities. Salmon Creek, the Sheep Creek Division, was committed to the mill itself. The mill and the town site, the infrastructure around that would take the ore from the mine and deliver it into the Jackling dry ore mill. And my favorite division is actually the Salmon Creek Division. This is where the civil engineers got to do a few things, building hydroelectric projects, which still stand today. The small part about this, which is more of a one of the human sides of this, was this fellow James Whipple, an assistant general manager to Jackling. It was actually his brother-in-law, and he was a football teammate of Thane on the year they won the 2 back-to-back championships against Stanford. The big game in Northern California, as it's still called. Thane was the quarterback, Whipple was the right end, and it's not hard, and you can actually find, I'm getting a chill thinking about it here, there's a statue on the Berkeley campus that talks about this event. It's a big deal. And a lot of the folks that don't show up on this org chart actually came out of the Berkeley program, probably played football with Thane as well. A real leader of men, and he probably was 40 pounds less in weight. The kid played at 145 pounds in a man's game. All right, so that was Thane's discretion, if you will, in the hiring. Jackling was in control of everything else. He knew that we were going to be buying a lot of material, delivering a lot of material, coordinating a lot of activities, and therefore efficient procurement was one of the areas of his particular interest. So, first thing he did, you can find in the record, he tells Thane, stop buying stuff by calling your buddies, right? You're going through my purchasing agent who's based in Salt Lake City, specifically for this project. And by the way, he's trained by my specialist who's in Salt Lake City, Mr. C.F. Jennings. He made this particularly clear to Jackling made this particularly clear to Thane in a letter from one to the other. Jackling believed in what he called systematic centralization of procurement. By this time, remember, his Jackling group was up and running. So this group as a whole was so large, as you read here, there is no justification for paying middlemen any profits or percentages. This is the kind of philosophy I think Sam Walton of Walmart fell in love with and brought it to what we have today, right? All right. Letters like this from Jackling to Thane, they're carbon copies, what have you here. That's where I think Thane probably got a little more eloquent. If you look at the record, Jackling was always concise and direct. And right here, he's talking about the crossover, how he's bringing people up from Utah, from Juneau, from Nevada, how he's taking samples from one. He's leveraging his entire infrastructure to deliver the project. Jackling reviewed weekly and monthly reports from each division. If that wasn't enough, Thane would write another letter about all the other things he thought would be interesting to Jackling to read. Stuff about politics, visitors, and probably more interesting, what's going on next door. Because what you read behind the scenes, 3 gold mines that close together, large-scale hard rock, why not try to put them all together and really make a portfolio that would excite investors and create a lot of value? That didn't happen in this case. So letters took some time, right? Steamship travel gave you 3 days, probably on a good day, your mail would get back and forth. But telegrams were part of the system, not a surprise, right? So in 1904, the Army put together, Alaska was a territory, of course, at the time, so some of the early investments that actually did something for the state of Alaska was a telegraph line, about 1,000 miles long. And they already had cables between Sitka and Juneau, so at that point in 1904, you could have almost instantaneous communication, and boy, did Thane and Jackling use it. This cable is an actual original example of a congratulation note from a shareholder talking to Thane about, way to go, guys, we're happy, stock's on the way up, tunnel is done. Messages of congratulations and well wishes were one thing, but when Jackling talked to you, and he really wanted to talk to you, he used a code. When he was talking about business, he coded his telegrams. Visiting Ray and Chino, that makes sense. That's probably not a big secret. No one who knew it was Jackling would guess that. Now, pallidness, Salt Lake, concisely dissection, you get the point, right? Strange, huh? This was a service that wasn't that unusual. The telegram services would, if you gave a list of key phrases in advance, they would be able to translate these, and we'll give you the translation in a moment. Before I do or move over to the next slide, you'll see here this was sent from East Las Vegas, New Mexico, on the 24th of February, 1914. Makes sense that he's between Ray and Chino, traveling through northern New Mexico, probably on his rail car. Interesting. So, visiting now, we'll return to Salt Lake in 10 days. I won't be there very long. I might see your engineer in Seattle if he wants to talk to me. That's what that was supposed to say. All right. The other, beyond communication and being incredibly precise in what he wanted to have done, Jackling insisted on an extended mill testing program. He knew that the 4-year operating period only processed about 300,000 tons of ore, and all of it by a stamp mill. And Jackling was not going to be running a stamp mill with his name attached to it, right? So when the reorganized Gastineau took over, Jackling gutted the mill and put in an entire flow circuit, which you see here in concept here from the original publication in 1920, AIME publication, I think, George, where he was running this mill daily, running through all the ore samples right out of the mine, trying to get a fair representative sample. How does he tune his system to deliver for this type of deposit? He also sent samples, as you saw in the letter, he sent samples back to Utah to confirm what he was finding out there in Juneau. This mill right here was a Perseverance mine, the old stamp mill. He only ran it for about 2 months till it burned down right before Christmas in 1912. Jackling said, I don't have enough data. Find me another mill. He found another mill. He ran it for 15 months until he was satisfied that his technology was going to work on the ore that they were fed. And it was this test work leading into the final confirmation of the design of the Jackling mill itself. Brief comment about the mine plan. I'm an engineer. This is the classic geology honorary statement I'll make here. So the ore zone that this Perseverance mine was after was 100 feet, could have been 100 feet wide. It wasn't narrow vein gold, but it was stringers and veins of quartz, pervasive in this steeply dipping formation, which had greenstone on one side on the hanging wall and metagabbro and schist on the other. So these guys are driving right through, trying to target and level down and just block cave this material all the way out the door down to the mill. Looking at this in cross-section, again, I'm repeating the claim boundary here. So on the lower side here, you actually have the tidewater. This is the Gastineau Channel. This is a saltwater body. This is where the Treadwell mine ran. Here was where the Jackling mill sat, right at tidewater. This is the Sheep Creek Basin back behind us. Right up here is the Sheep Creek Portal. And this is the 2-mile-long tunnel that connected back to the Silver Bowl Basin, where the man camp, and here's where the ore deposit sits right here. So in plan view, you're seeing the man camp right here, and you see a drift of the Alexander Crosscut into the center of this gray ore body. And here's a cross-section about the size of what it was in 1920. And what you see here, 200 tons per day in the past. We needed 6,000 tons per day, factor of 30. Sort of a shrinking stope mining method was in use here. And this is probably less of a Jackling thing, but more of the rest of the Utah copper guys. They needed to upgrade this plan to get that production factor up by a factor of 30. And not only that, you need manpower to do that, so there was a bunch of new construction at the man camp itself, a bunch of upgrades to the air compressor systems, the delivery, all the support systems, all to support the miners and the increased number of miners that had to basically, on order of magnitude, more draw points in cave areas had to be activated. And all this work, of course, was happening schedule-wise concurrent with these other Sheep Creek and Salmon Creek divisions. These draw points, you can see the exit. I can't show it on one slide right here perhaps, but here's the gold going out these two primary access shafts, headed out for the 2-mile ride out to the portal into Sheep Creek and then down to the mill. Here's a quick look at the design itself. It's a dry ore mill design, same design Jackling used at Utah Copper. Ore comes into the coarse crushing circuit up here at the top. There's a photo here of the ore train coming in, and then there's actually a 4-car tipple there in the right-hand slide. Coarse crushing went down to an underground silo, which allowed them to sort of attenuate or surge. They could run more production and have the mill down or do whatever. From this silo, it went into the fine crushing circuit. This is where their first gold, lead, iron concentrate came out. This went into the concentrating circuit, and of course, they had a retreatment process that produced their final product, which went out to the smelter for smelting in Seattle, actually. And tailings that came out of this process went into the Gastineau Channel. In fact, that's probably the only thing you'll see today, or one of the 3 things you'll see today from this property. Let's talk about the build for a second. I mentioned about organizational efficiency and the drive of Jackling to be exacting. So all this logistics coordinated through the Port of Seattle, whether it was men, materials, or equipment that came by rail. I'm drawing here just based on Kansas City I showed because that's where our steel came from the mill, or from sea, from San Francisco up to Seattle. Once everything got to Seattle, it had a 1,000-mile ride by a steamship all the way to the mine site where it had to be offloaded. Steamship travel in this time is probably worth having a short discussion about. Most of this water had been navigated. The gold rush certainly found a lot, the Klondike gold rush certainly found a lot of places to sink your boat. But once the wire dragging and once they kind of found a way, the shipping channels were opened up and companies formed overnight. Tourists, white collar, blue collar workers, general supplies. Northbound traffic would start in Seattle. I've tilted this 90 degrees. Start in Seattle and from right to left on the screen here. That was about a 3-day trip from Seattle to Ketchikan to Juneau. Sitka sits here, that's where the cable station was, and then Skagway, of course, was the gateway to the Klondike. 3 days to travel that route. The northbound route had one impact on the project. A freighter called the Curacao sank in June of 1913, 1,200 tons of cargo and some key equipment that Jackling. Now, this was one of dozens, if not hundreds, of shipments that they had to coordinate and get on site and installed. 39 passengers, 51 crew survived. Thane had to scramble, and purchasing in Seattle actually helped out quite a bit. Only cost them 2 months on a 30-month schedule, that delay. All right, let's talk about the build quickly. We've got a few slides here. So let's give credit to the Sheep Creek Tunnel built by the Perseverance Mine Division. 2 miles long, 8 feet by 10 feet. Started November 1912, 16 months later, in March of 1914, the two crews that worked from end to end met. Jackling and Thane were the first two people, dignitaries, to walk from the Sheep Creek portal and exit through the Perseverance portal. The mill itself came together nicely. The design, actually, George O. Bradley, another George, he's a consultant that worked at Chino. He worked at Utah Copper. He built this. He helped build the mill and design it for Jackling. Keep that name in mind, George O. Bradley. The steel that came here was used by the same company, this Kansas City Steel Company, the same supplier that Jackling used to build the Ray project in 1910. All right, my favorite one, the Salmon Creek Power people. All right, so what you see right here is north end, about 7 miles away from the main claim block, you have the Salmon Creek Dam sitting on the top here. This is a hydroelectric project that was built to produce 8,000 horsepower. Remember, Jackling's the one who started to electrify everything in his processes. He needed 8,000 horsepower to get to 6,000 tons per day of processing. These guys built this son of a gun in less than a year and a half as well. I think the point here is this facility was commissioned in 1914, and to this day, this facility provides 10% of the power to the city and borough of Juneau. Second project provides another 2,000. All right, let's talk quickly about the Salmon Creek, how they built that dam, because it took a lot of cement, okay? And they didn't have a batch plant in Juneau in 1914. So they imported almost 250,000 bags of cement. And it came in by ship like this on pallets. They would load it from the pallets onto a barge. They would take the barge 7 miles up the Gastronaut Channel to this specially built siding. They would load the barges, or they would offload the barge onto rails, and it had a 2.5-mile light rail ride up the hill to the dam site. And there is where it was mixed with local aggregate to produce the dam, to produce the material to build the dam. No reinforcement steel in this dam. First of its kind, that it's a compressed arch dam of a design using San Francisco design engineers. 160 feet tall, carries 19,000 acre feet of water. Again, it had some cosmetic fixes in 1967. Still doing the job today. Quickly about the startup. Ore trains went the length of this tunnel and came out of the portal on the right-hand side of the picture here, ran about another 2.5 or about 1.5 miles to the coarse crushing facility and into the mill. Avalanches are an issue here. You can kind of get a feel for that. This is the tail end of an avalanche chute. This area was threatened by avalanches, as was the access road between Thane and Juneau, and it was just something you lived with down there. You brought your shovel when you went to snow shovel when you went to work in the winter. The startup of the mill itself, 1915, first 1,500 tons came online. They got to the full 6,000 ton throughput within 12 months, and Jackling knew this. The only reason they stopped at 6 is because they needed more power. The mill could actually run at 10 to 12,000 tons per day. Extraordinary. So what did Jackling do? Go find me some more electric power. The same guy, Harry Wollenberg, who put together the Salmon Creek Dam on the left, went into the Annex Lake project. This paper is in the preprints, George. This is one of my favorite parts of the story, but you got to read the paper to get the details. Beyond that reinforcing steel conversation, these guys did an underground lake tap, and in record time, they had power going from the time they blasted 20 minutes before they had power arriving at the mill, 2,000 horsepower. that put the mill at 10,000 tons per day. All right, so we have a successful mill that ran like crazy, and we had a hydroelectric power plant that was up and running, but this is the story at the end. This isn't that unusual part of the story. Technology worked great, throughput was record-breaking, but grades did not live up to expectations. Basically, 60% of they only realized 60% of the mine plan, or the mine plan predicted for grade. It didn't matter how much ore they put through the mill, they were going to lose money, and they couldn't return to investors or return to capital. So, Jackling wasn't going to give up. Critics said, hey, look, you're not, you're used to making, you're a golden goose. You do these things for us, and you always come through for us, right? So this comment talks about the technical accomplishments of Jackling, right? Investors like to hear this because they know what he was capable of, but they also expected the spectacular financial results that followed, and that didn't happen. So that red arrow continued, and in 1920, operations were terminated. This is the end. After this failure, Jackling stayed in the front of his industry. The planning, designing, building, operating was replicated around the world. AIME Scholar Award, Medal Award, it's an extraordinary story, recognized many times over. He died at the age of 87 in California. Alaska Juneau, that quiet neighbor to the north, outlived everybody. They hired the same consultant that Jackling and Thane had used, George O. Bradley, and he took the same technology. The only difference is they changed how they mined, and they sort of had to high-grade their ore selection. But their mill, with the Jackling design essentially unchanged, ran for 20 years. Bart Thane, my favorite part of this story, he did all these wonderful things in that 4-year period with Jackling, and during the operations, he struggled to find another way to make the mine work. Jackling worked with him. They tried to do timber. They tried to do chemical. None of it really worked out, and he died in November of 1927. That was the end of his story. When I go to Juneau today, this is what you see. You can actually see the coarse crusher building sitting up on the hill where the tipple was located. You can see the foundations of the Gastineau mill. You can see the Salmon Creek Dam, a 7-mile drive away and a 2.5-mile hike. And right there in the bottom right is where I was in December of this year, or last year. Right there is about where that ore chute, or that connection between the coarse grade, this was all denuded, and this is actually the transit up and down the hill. And you see all you see are healthy, skinny Sitka spruce pines here. It's hard to find evidence of what was there. Jackling moved mountains around the world, and Thane really just lives in this story. Thank you.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you, Terry. Probably no time for questions here. Terry will be around. One comment, if you're a mining engineer, you can appreciate the fact that Jackling had the right idea, but the exploration geologists like it that. Beyond that, I'm not going to make any other comments. I did want to mention, though, that Albert Holden was in this story. I worked for Island Creek Coal Company. Albert Holden founded Island Creek Coal Company. He left because of health and went to Utah, and he hooked up with Jackling there. Whenever he was, they were submitting his application for the history Mining Hall of Fame. I had to go through the Island Creek records to prepare material for Albert Holden, and he was inducted into the Mining Hall of Fame. So with that, we're going to let Dick Bullock start. I'm not going to introduce Dick, other than the fact that he's from Missouri. We started on this Missouri theme here. The Missouri theme continues. If you want Dick's background, buy his book. We would appreciate that. But we'll
Thanks for the plug.
So we'll let Dick go ahead.
Okay. I'm here to talk to you this afternoon about 300 years of lead mining in southeast Missouri. I don't really know of any mining district in the world that's lasted that long with continuous mining. It never has stopped. Well, we're going to get this thing going in a minute.
Here, just hit, let's see, hold on. Let's see. There you go, here you go.
Okay.
So just hit that.
This is a busy slide, and I apologize for it, but the little squares here represent some of the early findings of lead in southeast Missouri. This blue area with all red dots is the granite knobs that formed from the Ozark uplift. And around that uplift, there was algal reefs formed in the Mississippian period. These algal reefs were the traps that trapped all the zinc, copper, and mostly lead in this prolific district that's been mining. You can see it mined pretty well around the entire uplift. Some of the mines that were really developed then, in the order that they were developed, was mine Lamont was developed first, and the Bon Terre mine, and mining around Flat River, Leadington, and then Deloge, Leadwood areas, Elva's mines were developed. And it took a step out to the west from Leadwood mines, the Hayden Creek mine, and then the Indian Creek mine was north of Potosi, about 20 miles, was a big major step out for St. Joe. The next step out was in the Viburnum Trend. They discovered the Viburnum Trend when they knew it was 50 miles long, but they couldn't control it all. But the mines that were developed then were the St. Joe Fletcher plant after the Viburnum, the Viburnum mines, the Cominco American mine, Amex Homestake mine plant and smelter, the Kennecott Sweetwater plant, the Brushy Creek plant was built, and the Sarco West Fork was built, and St. Joe Castile was the last mine that was developed in the district. So that pretty well covers the mines that were actually developed. But try to remember where these little crosses were. One down in Mine Lamont in the south, and these others up in the far Washington County and Franklin County, way up in here. The Indians probably were the first to discover lead in the Missouri in the 1700s or before 1700s. But when the French came into the settled area or the prospect area, they were looking for silver and gold. And the Indians took them to these silver-looking deposits, which turned out to be, of course, galena. But back in 1700, the explorers weren't particularly interested in lead. And so they didn't do much about it in 1700. But in 1720 or 1719, there was much mining up around Washington County in southern Missouri and over in some of the other nearby counties. And then in 1720, Lamont and Renault discovered the ores around Mine Lamont. They started mining in that area, and because the ore was outcropping there, they mined pretty continuously. And that mining in the old lead belt has mined continuously now, the old lead belt and the new lead belt for 300 straight years. They, of course, brought on built a lot of furnaces over in Washington County, just burned the ore on the surface. And in St. Francis County, there's a lot of these furnaces built, and it really is probably responsible for a lot of the lead oxide that's left in the soils around Flat River area. The mining, though, was not very, you could only go about 40, 50 feet. They hit the water table, they had to stop. They couldn't mine deeper than the water table. And that's what they were doing in this particular slide. In Moses Austin also came in and mined around Potosi. He got about, zillions of acres from the Spanish land grant and mined a very large area for a long time, long before he ever went to Texas, of course became of Texas fame. But then in 1864, St. Joe was formed in New York. They came out and started looking at the lead mines around this district. They bought about 1,000 acres in the Bon Terre area, and they knew that there probably was lead deeper, but they couldn't get to it. Before they invested in trying to sink shafts there, they brought in the first steam-powered diamond drill. And they found very good lead seams down deep, and they started developing these mines and mining them. This is an artist's version of some of the mining, the high stopes around Bonne Terre. This is the way they load the rock with, in this case, a through shovel. And this shows some of the mining in the district. Between 1869 and 1607, there was 14 other companies followed St. Joe's lead and brought drills in and started drilling out the whole district in the old lead belt. And these 15 companies, some of them were larger than others. The ones in yellow were the larger and the more prolific ones. But they mined 700 million pounds of lead between 1869 and 1907. 700 million pounds was quite a significant contribution to the world lead market. So that got everybody's attention. By 1935, though, St. Joe had acquired all the other companies. And from the Leadwood area over to Deloge, Flat River, all the way down to Leadington, St. Joe connected all these mines underground by railroad. And at one time, there was between 300 and 400 miles of railroad track connecting all these mines and going out to many stopes. It looked like a spider web. This is an artist's version showing some of the mining that went on. Here was an example of a high-back mining that went on. This is the way they were loading the ore with a St. Joe shovel. This is the way most of the ore was mined with a little column drill. They had gathering 10-ton trolley locomotives. And this is a very unique system of mining. You may have heard of the trapeze mining. Whoops. Trapeze mining that went on was only developed by St. Joe and the old lead belt, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. St. Joe stepped out in mining, as I mentioned earlier, at the Hayden Creek mine was the first step out about in 1940. Next step out was in 1950 at St. Joe Indian Creek mine north of Potosi. And then the big step out was the Viburnum Trend. Now, St. Joe discovered this long trend west of the knobs. It was 50 miles long. They had to drill out the whole thing very quickly before others discovered it. But it was on Clark National Forest land, very significant, because the government limited St. Joe to 27 miles of leasing, and the other 23 miles were put up for other companies to mine. So multiple companies came in and then developed the entire lead belt. St. Joe did build a town, Viburnum town, very modern, small town, very modern town up here. This was the corporate office or the division office that they built, and the airstrip by the office. Over time, the old lead belt, of course, they mined out the reserves. Grades got lower, resources got more difficult to find. So as one mine would shut down, the next door neighbor would start mining those remnants of reserves, and the mines just got a little bigger and bigger. By 1955, when I joined the company, there were 22 mines operating in the old lead belt and 6 mills, counting all the way to Indian Creek down to Mine Lamont. By 1968, that was reduced to eight mines and 1 mill. I was a mine superintendent of the Leadwood mine, and we had 4 of those mines. And our average haul underground from the stopes to the Flat River mill was 11 miles. 11 miles by railroad, and we were mining about 2.5% ore. So it was very tough to make an economics pay, but it did. By 1972, they had mined out the old lead belt. So after 110 years of mining, they shut down the last of the old lead belt mines. And what those weren't ready to retire were transferred to the Viburnum mines, and they closed the whole district there and let the mines fill with water. St. Joe, of course, St. Joe Doe Run has been the most dominant mining company in the southeast Missouri, in Missouri. St. Joe Lead became St. Joe Minerals Company and diversified into zinc, coal, oil, natural gas, iron, and gold mining all over the United States and in South America. However, they were extremely profitable. The coal and gold in the early 70 period was very lucrative. St. Joe became a cash cow, and the directors and the officers of the company decided to divide the company into a lead company, a zinc, a gold company, iron company, an energy company, and eventually sell it off to the highest bidder. I left St. Joe at that time. I wanted no part of it. The Lead Belt Coal and Gold Company were bought by Fluor in 1981, and then later on, a private investor bought the Lead Belt area and became Doe Run Resources Company, and that's what it is today, as they operate many mines still in the Viburnum area. Now, the rest of the slides will be kind of a pictorial review of what's very typical of the mining in the old Lead Belt were very, very high stopes. You probably have never seen mines quite like some of these mines in the old Lead Belt. Then I'll cover some of the progression of mining tools that were used in the Lead Belt, the prospecting tools, blast hole drilling, ore and rock moving equipment, hauling equipment, and a few examples of the mine plants that were built that I mentioned earlier. This is an artist's view of the typical mining, and this was in the Flatler area. This particular area was very famous, it's known as the Blue Ribbon Trail. It was going in from the number 11 mine in number 17. This is the ore trolley down here, the local down here with a string of 2.5 ton cars. That same scene, actually a photograph of it, is this. You can see a man standing right down here. These are 200-foot pillars, at least 200 foot, so it gives you some idea. And this wasn't just one place. There were many places in the Lead Belt that had 100, 150, 200, and in Bonne Terre, some of as much as 300-foot pillars. So very extensive, prolific mining in the Lead Belt. This is the Bonne Terre stope, and I know it is because of the very skinny pillars up at the top. The reason they were able to get away with very skinny pillars, they mined almost all of the surface. So it really wasn't holding up anything. It was maybe 10 or 20 feet of rock above them. So the weight of the pillar probably put more pressure on the pillars than the rock above it did. But you can see the men working the bluffs here and here. And this is and then the ore train way down here. This is another probably Bonne Terre stope. And this shows some of the very unique mining. Here's the loader, the St. Joe shovel down here, we're loading the rock pile. Whoops. Yeah. The miners, you probably can't see it from where you're sitting. There's two 12x12 boards up here. These boards are held up by steel rods and the cross members. These are called trapeze. Trapeze mining was very prevalent. Every stope of those 22 mines I told you, well, at least 20 of them, had one or two trapeze stopes running. And the first thing they did to a mining engineer when they brought him into the district was take him around the different mines and see how scared he was up on the traps. And they were only 24 inches wide, and they'd go out at maybe 100, 150 feet across the back. Wasn't so bad though, because you couldn't see, it was so dark you couldn't see the bottom, so you didn't realize how high you were. But this is a unique mining system, and this is an artist's view of the trapeze. And while they look very flimsy, they really weren't. They were well-engineered, designed platforms held by roof prods anchor bolts and cross members, and all these were bolted together, and very sturdy, very solid, and they were a very safe way to mine, even though it doesn't look like it. As a matter of fact, what these guys are doing, they're not mining, they're putting up a very primitive type of roof truss that was held by roof bolts. St. Joe invented roof bolts in 1927, and they were using them up till the World War II. Then the Bureau of Mines discovered them, and they then spread to the coal mines and then around the rest of the world. That was one of the developments of St. Joe. So here it shows going up to a ladder, but that was the way most of the access to the trapeze were what they call louse platforms. So these platforms were built every 4 feet, and you go up a ladder, put your stuff there, put it here, here, and go all the way up to 200 feet or whatever it was to get to the trapeze, and that would go out across the back. So that was a really unique mining system, worked very well, it was safe, and that was about the only way to get those high remnants of ore that were left, probably because they were too low grade when they mined the first pass through, but then they became commercial, and they had to go back and get them. Now then we'll talk about the different types of progression of mining tools. This is the first diamond drill that was brought into the area. It was a steam powered. This is an artist's version of it. I don't know how accurate that is, but this is an actual picture of a steam powered diamond drill that was used in the district. This is a later version of a diamond drill. Sits in the museum in the Park Hills, the old 17 mill that turned into a museum. I know nothing about the drill except it probably was it looks like an electric motor sitting there. This was the drills that were used when I came in the district in 1955. They were used very extensively in 1940 to about 1960. And then about 20 or 30 of these drills work in the district, drilling every 50 feet along the whole area, punching to find these pods of ore that were left. I don't have a picture of single jacking or double jacking, but this art of view of what they probably used for 100 years to mine out very large areas of the old lead belt. But when the jackhammers were finally developed, they were great, and they held handheld jackhammers for low holes, but for higher holes, these miners had very ingeniously put spikes on the ladder, and somehow they would get the drill started and tie these jackhammers to these spikes and lean against this ladder and for high holes and push it in like a very long jack lag, so to speak. These were very primitive drills. They eventually developed two boards that slid over each other with a crank, and they crank it up and look just like a jack lag. They were using those still when I got in the district. But this was the main drill used for the whole district between the 1930s and 1972, between the 40s and 72. This is the drill that was used primarily throughout the lead belt. They had many, many stopes. They had 200 stopes running at one time. And so each man had to have a drill that could handle himself. They were very small Cleveland HC10 machines, had a 2 5/8 inch piston, had a 30 or 36 inch pusher air piston to push the drill in, and they drill a small hole. It bottomed at 1 3/16 inches. I know this picture was taken after 1960 because that's a St. Joe pressure pot for loading ANFO, prilled ANFO. We developed the first mines anywhere that were able to use ammonium nitrate prills in that small a hole. But commercially, these pressure pots were larger and sell for around $500. We had to have 200 of them. So we could build that pressure pot for $25 in our shops, and it worked very well for what we needed for. And one man could handle the whole thing. This is what that HC10 looked like sitting on the end of a trap, and that's the way they drill a brow. They'd set this up, anchored very well, and he was tied off by a harness So he was safe. As you can see, it's very solid. And they drilled this prow, it was about 4 foot, and they drilled it and blasted it down. Jacklings didn't take over very fast in the lead belt because the backs were so high. But in many places, they could be used for slabbing pillars and for development drifts. The first jumbo was an air-powered jumbo. The two motors on the back were air motors. They tram, they lift they run the machines and lift the booms, but all the positioning had to be done by hand. There was no remote control to it. So the guys had to get up on a ladder to adjust the feeds and to actually operate the drills. It sounds very rugged, but it was better than what they had before, I guess. And there were many versions of electric drills that came along with hydraulic mechanisms that were much better. Then we jumped to this one. This is the one we developed with Joy Manufacturing Company to develop the first RPD drills used in the country. It is a hydraulic hammer, a hydraulic rotary, and an air hammer. And they would drill about 4 feet a minute compared to the air drills of 2 feet a minute. It took us 8 years working with Joy to develop this system of drilling. But it was very successful. And we designed the jumbo ourselves and built it in our shops. And it was a prototype. We tried it out in the mines, worked very well, so then we bought several of these jumbos away from them, eventually going to Denver. This is the next big step. We worked with Ingersoll Rand to develop the first all hydraulic drill that was ever put underground in any of the mines of Missouri or in any place. And these were hydraulic drills completely, and they drilled about 8 feet a minute using an RPD bit. It was very successful, and we bought 3 of these jumbos and scattered them throughout the Fletcher mines. Then we went to Joy all hydraulic drills and used those. The first loader, besides hand loading was used for at least 100 years in the old lead belt. And that was just strictly shovel into the mine cars. But the first loader was a semi-mechanized. It wasn't powerful enough to push into the rock very far, but it had a similar kind of gathering arms up in the front. But the miners had to shovel rock down to the front of the machine, conveyed it up, and loaded it in a mine car. That was a Myers Worley loader. Then they went to the through shovels, and they were very successful. They had a way to push the boom out into the rock pile, raise the boom, swivel around on the treads, and load in a mine car. So St. Joe operated many of these shovels underground for many years. And this was a Conway shovel used for development only. Was used up to was still used in '55 when I got there. It was a little better than the IMCO 11Bs that were limited on the width they could go. The Conway shovel could load out a little wider than the 11B IMCO could load. And they were very difficult to run though, because every motion had its own lever. And it took a genius to run these things, or someone who was very, very agile. This is a St. Joe shovel. It was designed, built by St. Joe. St. Joe at that time had their own foundries, their own shops, and they built this shovel completely themselves. Later on, they gave all the patents, all the molds and everything to the Thu company. Thu built the shovel, and St. Joe bought 100 of them and put them to work in the mines. They had a chain, pushed the boom out and pushed it into the rock pile. There was a pulley system, raised it up, it swiveled 360 degrees, and it was tread powered, and there were 2 electric motors that ran the whole system. They were very, very efficient, very low maintenance, very dependable piece of equipment. This is an actual picture of the St. Joe shovel, which operated from the 30s clear up into the Viburnum mines. Burnham 27 was equipped with St. Joe shovels, as was the Indian Creek mine. So they lasted a long time, clear up to, they closed the 27 mine. The Joy Getting Arm Loader was used a lot in the lead belt. Very efficient, but they were built for coal mines, so the maintenance was very high, and you may get 400 tons one shift and 25 tons the next. They weren't very dependable because they really weren't built for hard rock, and though they did use a lot of them. 630 AIME replaced the Conway shovel in developments, and they used quite a few of those. And then they went to the first load haul dump units. This is the Sanford Day transloader. It was really developed by American Zinc, if you may remember the old Gizmo. And then Sanford Day bought out the patents, started producing the equipment. They were a 6-ton bucket, and they loaded the rock by ramming into the rock pile, and then raising the bucket, and then ram it again until they got the 6-ton bucket full. The big advantage to the transloader was they were very fast. But American Zinc developed them, but their roads weren't very straight. And when we brought those machines to Burnham, our roads were long and straight and very well graded, smooth. So one of these machines would run 20, 25 miles an hour. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a mine when someone's going 25 miles an hour, but that's fast. And they were very productive. We'd get 200 tons a shift at 3,000 feet. So they were very productive. However, they were high maintenance, and they tore up a lot of front tires. They brought the 980s in the mine first, and they brought this down to 988s. At first, St. Joe had to change all the linkage in the front and make the front end loader into a load haul dump unit. The bucket would level at a low height. And we put a Balderson bucket we bought in Kansas City on the front of the dipper, using it as a LHD, and eventually it's used to load trucks. Then we did the same thing with the 988. We put a Balderson 8-ton bucket on the front, and eventually Cat started doing the same thing to other loaders, and you didn't have to do it yourself. But there were a lot of Cat 980s and 988 used in the Viburnum district. As far as I know, this is the first powered unit, the haulage unit, very cheap on maintenance. The fuel was about 2 buckets of oats every day, and they worked very well. They had to only work one shift, or each mule would work his own shift. And when I came to the district, they were all gone. But they took the mules out of the mines somewhere between 1950 and 1952, when the last mules were removed. At one time, they had about 400 mules working the entire district, in the St. Joe district. And they worked so many years, and they'd take the mule out of the ground, out from underground, and they let him have many years out in the pasture. They weren't cruel to the animals at all, or treated them very well. Those mules were used for gathering. They didn't haul away the shaft. They just used for gathering into the main line. So what the mules were replaced by was by the shuttle car. And shuttle cars, again, were built for coal mines at first, but they did pretty well in our rock for the metal lines. And they would use lots and lots of different types of, both the Joy and Jeffrey shuttle cars, to gather rock into these either 2.5 ton or 10-ton mine cars. That was one of the progressions. However, they did move very slow in the mines. As I mentioned before, we like things to move a little bit faster. Well, of course, a truck would move faster. So St. Joe built their own at first, 6-ton trucks. An outfit in St. Louis built them for them at first. Then they started buying 10-ton Klein trucks like this one. St. Joe Shovel could load those trucks, and later, of course, 980s could load it. This was the 27 mine. But the Klein truck was a very 10-ton truck used in the Indian Creek mine and the 27 mine mainly. We tried many different types of trucks. This happens to be a ejectol, 20-ton ejectol. We tried the Wagner trucks. They were dependable, but they moved too slow. For one application where I had to haul ore for about 3,000 feet from a chute, we took a transloader unit, a power unit, I designed and built the truck. It was built in their shops. And it was a 20-ton truck used from shuttling from that automatic chute into the dump, and it was a very efficient truck also. This was the last mill that closed in the old lead belt was the 17 Federal Mill. It was producing about 14,000 tons a day. Usually about 8 mines pull their ore into this facility. They also, of course, sold agricultural lime to the whole Midwest. This is a lime field here where they loaded trains and pulled them out for commercial use. This is the Indian Creek mine. Had it's a 2,000 ton a day mine and plant. And notice that there are 5 buildings in this plant. It had a very large footprint for just a 2,000 ton plant. St. Joe changed that philosophy when they went to the new lead belt for some of the mines. This is a 28 shaft, and I put it on here because in this shaft, the 28 mine produced for the mill, but also the 27 mine and 29 mine hauled 4 miles into this dump. So 3 mines fed this mill at Viburnum, and they produced about 7,000 tons a day. This is the West Fork plant. They use a Kepi hoist. There's a good picture of a Kepi hoist in the district. That's why I put this in there. By the way, all these pictures are properties of Doe Run. They very graciously loaned them to me. This is the Brushy Creek plant. It's the mirror image of the Fletcher plant that was built 4 years before it. Notice now there's only 2 buildings, and the plant's a 5,000 ton plant. So and then much smaller footprint. This is a small chemical storage over here. But in the Fletcher plant, when the mine was still fairly small, I was able to produce 5,200 tons a day with 125 men. 125 men produced underground and surface, and that's all we had to produce that 5,200 tons a day. That was counting me, so they were very productive mines at the time. This is a Sweetwater plant built back in the 70s. It's been a very productive plant. It's run for many, many years and very efficient. Thank you for your attention. It's the story of all these mining companies by an old miner who remembers about 70 years of this lead belt mining. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Dick real quick? 1 or 2 quick questions? No. Okay, we're going to stay on schedule. What?
How about a comment?
Go ahead.
Did an excellent job.
Thank you. I'm actually just a hair younger than Dick is, but when I started working in the coal mines, there was still a mine. I was in a mine that was still using mules for haulage. So I'm maybe just a little bit older or younger than you, not too much. So now we're going to go with Crystal. We're going to switch gears, or we're going to talk. For those of you that are familiar with SPE, we have SPE has the Anthony Lucas Medal that's given in SPE. He's considered the founder of reservoir analysis within the petroleum industry. But he's a mining guy, so this will be very interesting.
All right, and I'll try to be quick here. So my talk is on Anthony Lucas and how he started as a mining engineer and how he really sort of kicked off the mining industry in southern Louisiana. So my talk's going to focus on the work that he did starting at Avery Island as a mining engineer and then moved through the exploration that he did at Jefferson Island, Belle Isle, Weeks Island, Anse Butte, and finally we have to talk about Spindletop Dome. So a lot of people aren't really familiar with salt dome salt deposits, so we're going to be talking about the salt deposits in southern Louisiana. And these are salt domes that expand all the way from Alabama, Mississippi, all the way through Texas. And so specifically, these are the domes that I'm going to be talking about today that Anthony Lucas worked on, beginning at Avery Island on just off of the Louisiana coast. So Anthony Lucas was actually born Antonin Lucic in Croatia. He got his engineering degree at the age of 20, and then shortly thereafter joined the Austrian Navy. He got a call from his uncle, and who was working in Saginaw, Michigan at the time, to come out and help him out with a lumber mill problem that he was having with developing a gang saw. So he came out to Saginaw, Michigan, and that's where Anthony Lucas got his first taste in the salt mining industry. At this time, the lumber industry in Saginaw was really tied with brine operations that were going on. And these two industries were really kind of side by side, so he likely became first acquainted with salt brining operations while he was in Saginaw. And so then from there, he becomes an American citizen, moves to DC, and then is looking for work in the mining industry. He comes out to Colorado for a really short time for some gold prospecting. He doesn't really have a lot of luck, and so that's kind of where my story today starts. So Anthony Lucas starts his salt mining career at Avery Island. But Avery Island, Louisiana had salt history dating back through, prehistory. But the first recorded discovery was in 1791 when the salt brine springs were recorded by the island's owner. And so from that time, the initial discovery of brine springs, the initial operators and owners of the island, really they're developing this resource. They're evaporating salt in these large vats, and they're producing a product that's mostly just sold locally. They're not really a large operation. But during the Civil War, things change a little bit. The majority of salt in this country at that time is produced in New York. And during the Civil War, their supply is essentially cut off in the South. And so the owners of Avery Island decide that they're going to expand their salt brine, their spring. And so they begin to dig down where their spring is, and about 16 feet below the surface, they hit solid rock salt, 16 feet below the surface on Avery Island. And so they shut down, they leave the sugar cane rotting in the fields. Salt is their new industry. So for 11 months, they focus on developing salt mining pits at Avery Island, and they supply salt throughout the Confederacy, all the way from Louisiana, all the way up through Virginia. So after the Civil War, the American Bureau of Mines does a study for the Avery family and develops a plan that they can use to start the first underground mine at Avery Island. And a few years later, they actually begin operations. They decide to do approximately a 90-foot shaft and have, so they have 90-foot shaft as their first level of mining. The rooms are approximately 40 feet wide, 25 feet high, and this is really where Avery Island becomes the first underground salt mine in the United States. And then a few years later, they deepen the shaft. They're starting to have some issues at their upper level, their 90-foot level. They're having leak control issues. They're having cave-ins. And so they deepen the shaft to approximately 168 feet and start developing their mine on the 160-foot level. And this is kind of pretty timely because just about this time, they have to abandon the upper level of the mine because of floods and inflows. They really can't control that, so they become, basically they're mining down then at the 160-foot level when Anthony Lucas arrives at Avery Island in 1893. And so they hire Anthony Lucas. At the time, the company running the salt mine is Miles & Company, and they hire Lucas as a mining engineer to help develop the mine plan and also mostly to deal with the leak problem that they're having and so then Lucas becomes their America's first, leak control engineer. So things go from bad to worse. In July 1895, the 160-foot level that was working out, it has to be abandoned because the mine has additional floods. And a month later, they have a significant cave-in at the surface. Really, the topography of the area is just completely devastated at this point in time. Their railroad is about to fall into these sinkholes that are 20 to 60 feet deep, and their mill's pretty much, as you can see too, it's right on the edge of these shafts. So they've really got some significant problems going on at the time at the mine. So a couple years later, by 1898, the owners of the property, the Averys, decide to let the lease for Miles & Company, they're like, we're going to let the lease expire, and these guys are going to be done salt mining here. But that's not quite the end of the story at Avery Island. A year later, the Averys decide to pick back up. They don't want to lose their investment, and they develop a new shaft, approximately just a few miles to the southwest of where the first mine was. And by 1900, they had a new hoist and were operating and ready to go. And today, Avery Island is still operated. It's one of the longest continually operated salt mines in the U.S. And if you go down to Avery Island, they're more famous for Tabasco and probably more so than salt today. So at the time, though, when things were happening at Avery Island, Joseph Jefferson, a famous actor of the day, he calls up and he says, I'm trying to drill a well. Can you send over your engineer and have him help me out? And so Anthony Lucas goes over to Jefferson Island originally to help with this well development. And they get down, they get through the gravel that's causing the drillers problems, and they strike salt at approximately 100 feet. And this is really great news for Miles and Company. And so they say, probably on their own dime, they pay for Lucas to do an exploration program at Jefferson Island. And so Lucas, while he's still working at Avery Island, also then sort of concurrently conducts an exploration program over at Jefferson Island. And he drills four different boreholes ranging in depth from 150 to 2,100 feet and maps the top of the salt. And the goal is really to see where they can find the shallowest salt so that if they have a new shaft, they don't have to go too far deep through the unconsolidated sediments. But it'll be after Lucas's time, before salt mining is actually developed at Jefferson Island. Joseph Jefferson at the time, he knows what's going on at Avery Island. He sees the damage, the litigation that's ensuing. And so he kind of puts a hold on it and says, I don't want this to happen here. And so nothing else happens at Jefferson Island until after Joseph Jefferson's death. And this here, I kind of like this picture. This shows Joseph Jefferson in the center, Anthony Lucas is crouched down, and here they're just examining some of the first salt core that was ever obtained in Louisiana. So after Joseph Jefferson's death, approximately 1919, his heirs sell the property, and the Jefferson Island Salt Mining Company is formed, and production began in 1923, and I think is still continuing today. After all of this, after Anthony Lucas, he's pretty much done at Avery Island, he goes over to Belle Isle. The owners of Belle Isle say, we have a similar topography. We think there could be salt here just based on the topographic features that this could be a salto. But they don't have any money to pay them, so they say, if you do the exploration program for us, we'll give you half share of the mineral rights. And Anthony Lucas agrees to this, which turns out actually to be a really good benefit for him. So he drills a 4-well exploration program in 1896, and in 1897, the Gulf Company buys out his mineral rights. They give him $30,000 cash, $5,000 bond. So at this day and age, he's kind of living high. And so he can, all right, so after Anthony Lucas leaves, Belle Isle continues. The Gulf Company buys them out, and they begin shaft construction. They get down to the level of their mine. The first drift, as they're going through, they hit the edge of the salt dome. The salt dome floods quicksand. They have to abandon the first effort for mining operations. A few years later, they try it again, 1903, 1904. They're drilling their shaft down, and they don't even get to the top of the salt. They have similar problems. The shaft fills with quicksand. They have to abandon every attempt. And it wasn't until the 1960s before anyone tried to again operate and mine salt at Belle Isle. So Weeks Island, the Miles and Company really financed the operations and exploration at Weeks Island Salt. And this is who Anthony Lucas was working for at the time. And Miles and Company, really, they were trying to find a replacement for the Avery Island mine. They knew things were going bad, and they were trying to find another source of revenue. And so they developed a drilling program. First, it started off by Conrad, and then they brought Lucas over back, and he continued the exploration program. And then their exploration at Weeks Island was finished by a gentleman, George Cowie. So this is where, though Lucas had just pretty much finished his exploration at Belle Isle, he just got his big payout, and so he quits. And there's some ensuing litigation between Anthony Lucas and his employer, Miles and Company. They want to sue him for breach of contract. He wants to get paid. And really, though, Anthony Lucas at this time, he's decided that he's done with the salt industry, and he wants to look at a new prospect, and that's oil. But at Weeks Island, there was, a really good salt deposit, and all the exploration that Miles and Company did eventually led to the sinking of a shaft in 1898. And by 1902, they had reached the 600-foot level of salt, were begin mining, and so finally Miles and Company had their replacement for the Avery Island mine. So one step back is, while he was exploring at Belle Isle, Anthony Lucas sort of discovered the correlation between not only salt, but he encountered a sulfur cap rock, and he found oil and gas trapped within the salt. He tells the story in one of his documents about when they were bringing salt core up to the surface at Belle Isle, that it would just sort of pop and crackle and stuff when they brought it to the derrick floor. And so that's kind of how he realized then that there was this association between petroleum and salt. And so when Anthony Lucas goes to Ansel's Butte, he doesn't go there for salt, although it's a salt dome. He goes there specifically looking for oil. And why did he go to Ansel's Butte is generally there had been known for at least 10 years prior that this area had some natural gas seeps, there was paraffin dirt on the surface. And I think it's really cool is some of the locals had stuck some metal pipes down into the ground and just lit them, and there were these natural gas torches where everybody would have big old parties back in the 1890s, and apparently it was the thing to behold. So in 1899, Lucas drills one well just off the northeast side of the salt dome there, and he says he claims that he encounters oil and a little bit of brine salt, but it really wasn't favorable. It clearly didn't find much of anything, and so he takes off and he leaves. But later, Ansel's Butte, after oil is discovered later in Texas, then the area has subsequent exploration, mostly looking for oil through the 1930s, but then finally some solution mining happened on Ansel's Butte in the 1920s. So in 1899, after he leaves Ansel's Butte, Anthony Lucas answers a trade journal article for someone who can help with the drilling operations over at Spindletop Dome in Beaumont, Texas. And his first well drills down to about 575 feet. They don't really find much of anything at all, and funds are running low. So they get some infusion of capital the next year. And in January 1901, Anthony Lucas strikes his famous oil gusher. And this is really what puts Anthony Lucas on the map. He hit oil, and the well instantly was producing 3,000 to 5,000 barrels a day. It was a gushing well that they couldn't even get under control for about 6-7 days. And so a month or two after this initial discovery, there were over 200 rigs on site. So Beaumont goes from a town of less than 9,000 people to over 50,000 almost overnight. And the state of Texas has initially a production of 1,000 barrels per year of oil to over 21 million barrels of oil in 1 year's time. So, and that is the end of my story.
Thank you, Crystal. Great presentation. Does anybody have any questions? We have time for questions. Okay, thank you very much, appreciate it. Very good presentation. I'm going to deviate slightly from the schedule here. I'm going to move my presentation to the end, and I'm going to let Mark come up and give his presentation, and then we'll do Mike's, and then I'll go to the end. That way, if people leave, I'm the one impacted by my inability to control speakers to the time allocated. Just a couple quick comments on Mark while he's getting his presentation set up here. Mark is different from the rest of us that have been presenting. We actually have a professional historian up here. Mark's an associate professor of history at the University of California, San Diego. He's also written a book, American Labor and Economic Citizenship, New Capitalism from World War I to the Great Depression. His current project explores how the work of American mining engineers and economic geologists working abroad between 1880 and 1930 helped shape the development of the 20th century American capitalism, science, and foreign policy. He holds an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation New Directions Fellowship. So here we had Mellon who financed some of the work that Lucas did. Now we have a tie back here too on this. And so he's been studying the mining industry with scholars at Colorado School of Mines and Michigan Tech. So I think you'll find this talk fascinating. He's going to talk about John Hayes Hammond, who's a fabulous guy. I collect books, and one of the sets of books I have is John Hayes Hammond's autobiography,
Yeah.
signed by John Hayes Hammond.
Really?
So,
Oh, you mentioned that you had it. You
Yeah.
had read it. That's great. Yeah, so my being here does probably require a couple of additional words of explanation how a historian ends up at this conference. And basically what happened is I study economic history in particular. And I started to look at U.S. foreign direct investment questions. I was looking for an industry, or I was looking for a company to explore. And for a variety of reasons that we get into at another time, I eventually migrated towards mining. I started working on this book, and the politics, the economics of the situation, some of the social conditions, the labor issues, those are all things that I could make sense of by and large. But when I was in the archives, or I was going through their publications, when it got to the mining, the metallurgy, the exploration part of the story, next page, right? I couldn't make sense of any of that material. So this Andrew W. Mellon Foundation basically provides, there's a lot of things obviously, but one of the things that it does with this New Directions Fellowship is it takes people who are mid-career, which I guess that's what I am, and sends them back to school. So I literally went back to school, went to Michigan Tech University during fall semester of 2016, studied mining engineering there with a couple of people. I don't see you right now. And then in the fall of 2017, went to Colorado School of Mines, where I had the great pleasure to take Professor Corby Anderson's hydrometallurgy course, sitting in on Professor Eric Spiller's course on mineral processing. Made some great friends with them. It was a great experience. And in addition to classroom, I had Paul Jones, who took me out in the field. We did several field trips over the course of my time at Mines, and kind of began really not just a study, but friendships with a number of different scholars there. So a great experience, and that's sort of how I ended up here. I want to talk today about someone. I'm going to describe them, and then my title kind of gives it away, but somebody who had quite a reputation, who at his time was the most famous mining engineer in the world. Just a few things that defined him. He was the highest paid salaried employee on the globe, made $1,250,000 a year, plus the share in all of the mines that the Guggenheims invested in. Worked in mines around the world. I mentioned in Siberia, in Mexico, Chile, South Africa, and beyond. He was sought out for his opinions by the major newspapers of the day, not just on mining issues, but a whole range of issues on foreign policy, on labor, on social and economic issues. He's a reformer. He supports the suffrage. He's a strong advocate in the World War I period for the League of Nations and the World Court. Was an early conservationist, even kind of an environmentalist to some degree or another. Worked with Teddy Roosevelt and his National Conservation Commission. Also in Montana. Found something here for Corby. In Montana, they after Anaconda mining had gone on for a while, the environmental consequences become clear. The federal government needs a neutral arbiter who can step forward and represent the public, not industry, right, not the local population, but the broader public. Who do they choose? They choose this mining engineer. He counted presidents, business tycoons, and foreign leaders, all of as his close friends. And in the 1920s, in the Harding administration, allies pushed him to become the Secretary of Commerce. Now, you kind of know how this goes based on the title, but this definition, this sort of description of somebody, for the most part, we would think of Hoover, right? But in this case, the person who I'm actually describing here is this John Hayes Hammond. The Washington Post in 1908 said of Hammond, Hammond is not quite the foremost man in the world, but surely the foremost mining engineer. Many capable observers believe that engineers as a class will exercise a large influence in governmental affairs into the future. And just to put this into perspective, Hoover in 1908 would have been in his early 30s, known a little bit within the mining industry. His name had graced the pages of the Washington Post, one fleeting reference in 1908, whereas Hammond was regularly appeared in the paper. And this isn't a story of someone just a fleeting fame. On May 3rd of 1926, a group of Hammond's friends celebrated his 71st birthday in the Grand Ballroom of New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel. So prestigious was the event that similar events were held that same night in 3 other American cities, as well as in London, Paris, Lisbon, Manila, and South Africa. Back at the Waldorf Astoria, Hammond received a bound volume with 10,000 statements that, at least according to, 10,000 messages honoring his life work that had been sent, time reported, by men of all walks of life, ambassadors, financiers, politicians, scientists, admirals, and artists. Those who came to the event and those who wrote in admiration celebrated a man who, according to Time magazine, had lived a life as few men can or even could have lived. He was, according to Time magazine, the most radically democratic millionaire. That was on May 3rd, May 10th, Time put Hammond on his after his 71st birthday on the cover of Time magazine. So we have here is a person of real significance, not just famous at a particular moment in 1908, but really famous throughout the early part of the 20th century and influential, as that introduction hopefully suggested. We're not going to get to all aspects of Hammond's life, to be sure, but I do want to focus on a couple of different things that suggest his significance. Did he engage in mining engineering? Yes. Did he make people rich? Yes. Did he get rich? Yes, he got rich as well. But he's also important for other reasons in this period. First one, think about the deflationary price spiral. Between the 1870s and the 1890s, in the United States and in really all Western countries, there's downward pressure on prices. It's deflation. Why do I bring this up here? This is actually a mining problem. You want to guess why? No? Gold, on the gold standard. So if economic growth is going like this, the supply of gold is going like this, you got a problem. You've got downward pressure on prices. Now, so that's kind of a hard one to figure out. I like to turn it around when I'm talking about this to groups. If you think about it the other way, if you've got a lot of gold, a dramatic increase in the amount of gold that's being produced, right, you're going to be able to coin more money, and that's going to have an inflationary pressure on prices. So here it's deflation, downward pressure on prices in this period. Second thing, overproduction and oversavings. When Americans in this period, between the 1870s and the 1890s, they're looking around and trying to explain, why do we have so much labor capital conflict? Why do we have so much employment? Why are we facing a society that seems to be almost falling apart in some respects? Two of the explanations were overproduction and oversavings. Overproduction of goods, oversavings of capital. And one of the leading experts at the time, Charles Conant, in 1898, said that if the U.S. does not work to ensure the U.S. capital can be employed abroad, it will continue the needless duplication of existing means of production and communication, with a glut of unconsumed products, the convulsions followed by trade stagnation, and the steadily declining return upon investment. All right? So there's too much savings, right? We're producing too many goods. We don't have a market for those goods. What can we do? Well, we need to find new markets. Think about U.S. expansion in the context of the 1890s. Part of the explanation is this. But if you're trying to find a market for oversavings and overproduction of goods, mining is almost perfect, right? Because not only can you you can invest some of that money in mines abroad, but then you can also open up markets for American manufactured goods in this period. And we'll see that Hammond plays a central role in making that possible. And if we're looking at evidence of this happening, just the statistics here, in 1897 we had about $134 million in foreign direct investment in mining. By the time we get to World War I in 1914, that had increased to $720 million. So this is indeed a period where we're seeing a lot more FDI in the mining sectors in this era. And the last thing is thinking about Hammond and those like him as conduits for change. As the introduction suggested, he's much more than a mining engineer. He's somebody who has a certain level of expertise about issues around the globe. And I was like this quote from David Livingstone, a British missionary and explorer. He said, "The extension and the use of railroads, steamships, telegraphs break down nationalities and bring people geographically remote into close connection. They make the world one." It's a connecting world in this period. And mining engineers play an important role. Well, if you're going to have railroads, you're going to have steamships, you're going to have telegraphs. What are you going to need? A lot of stuff that comes out of the ground to make those things possible. But in terms of connecting the world as well, they had experiences that others didn't in the United States. So when things happen, I'm going to use South Africa as the example that we're going to look at today. When things are happening in South Africa, say in the Boer War at the turn of the century, and they're casting about for who's been there? Who can understand the situation? It's people like Hammond and others who had experience for not just over days or weeks, but years of experience in that country. So they connect the world literally through the stuff they take out of the ground, but also through the expertise that they muster, not just about the United States, but other places as well. In terms of his background, he's educated at Yale, and then like many of his generation who were interested in mining, the education in the United States in the 1870s just didn't quite measure up to education in places like Freiburg in particular. So he joins, we didn't have the AIME talk, but he joins people like Raymond Rossiter, the second president of the Mining Engineers Institution, James Haig, a number of the giants in the field in this period, in getting their education abroad. He gets back to the United States in 1879. This is the first year of the USGS. He's at a critical moment in his career. He gets a job offer from William Randolph Hearst to work in his mines, but he simultaneously gets an offer from the USGS, and he chooses to work for the USGS in its early years, like many of his generation did, because it was seen as sort of a unique opportunity, not just to learn about an individual mine, but to get a broader sense of what was going on within the mining industry at that particular moment. From there, in the early part of the 1880s, he works for the Janin family. If you know anything about the history of mining engineers, the Janins are sort of the first family of American mining engineers, 3 generations of Janins. They tap Hammond and send him to Mexico in the early part of the 1880s. Really fascinating time to be in Mexico. As regime change, the Diaz government is coming in. They're making a lot of concessions to mining companies to try to attract capital to develop the mines of that country. Railroads are developing, particularly as a result of U.S. investment in that part of the world. And Hammond isn't alone. The Engineering Mining Journal in 1896 described that every year it seems like there's more and more American mining engineers who are in demand, not in the United States, but abroad. And indeed, the statistics bear that out. The Bureau of Mines did a survey in 1917 of where mining engineers were working or had worked in this outside of the United States, and you can see lots of experience in Europe for sure, but other places as well: Africa, Australia, Canada, Central America, South America, South Africa, and beyond. So he joins this sort of cohort early on in his career in the early part of the 1880s, who is is working on behalf of usually British capital, at least initially, but then eventually American capital as that FDI starts to increase. So he's got a long career. I just want to focus on a snapshot here of his career, and then I'll kind of make a gesture to some future issues as well. But between 1893 and 1895, Hammond is a mining engineer working in South Africa, having a great deal of success, as we'll see, but with some help from the USGS. The man on the upper right is not Hammond, somebody by the name of George F. Becker, who was a geologist in charge, really a lifetime employee of the USGS. And a really interesting story, back in when Hammond was working for the USGS in 1879, he actually worked directly, reported to Becker in California, where the two were doing their research. Fast forward to 1893, Hammond's in South Africa. He's making the case that mines that now are going down maybe 1,000 or 2,000 feet could go down 5,000 feet for gold mining. There's a real question about whether or not the British investors want to make this investment. So back in London, London says, we need somebody else to come in here and check this situation out. And they contact somebody by the name of Alexander Agassiz, who at that time is the head of the Comparative Museum of Zoology at Harvard, but better known in mining circles for what he did in the early part of the mid-1860s up in the Keweenaw Peninsula, where Michigan Tech is. The mining industry was very unstable up there, and Agassiz was one of the few who had confidence in what was going on in the UP, that in fact there was in fact a significant amount of copper that could be extracted profitably. And he goes up there and stabilizes the industry, and the rest is history, I guess, as this all is. But the copper mines in the UP and the Keweenaw become some of the most profitable and productive in the world. So they go to him, the British investors go to Agassiz and say, could you come over to South Africa, check this out, and make sure we're making a good decision? He says, I can't make it. But you know what? I know some people who might be useful. This guy, George F. Becker, who is kind of a lifelong friend going back to childhood, I know him. Maybe he could come to South Africa and he could investigate the situation and give you a recommendation. Becker leaves almost immediately. The money was very good. Leaves for South Africa and confirms Hammond's findings. And eventually the gold mining, as we'll see, becomes very, very productive in this period. We think about Hammond as a funneler of capital. If oversavings and overproduction are a problem, he was definitely that. And a lot of times when we think about U.S. expansion abroad, and you think about maybe mining engineers, think maybe they went to work for American companies, maybe the federal government, the U.S. government had a footprint in Africa, but neither of those things are the case. In fact, if we look at investment in Africa as a whole, historian Richard Hull has written that in the 1890s, it was almost an impossible task to convince businessmen in the United States to make capital investments in Africa. If we think about increasing FDI in Africa in this period, I argue that the mining engineers and the economic geologists played a central role. They sort of got there first, as it were, and then attracted that capital in. And you might say that, this Conant guy, policymakers are saying this thing about oversavings, overproduction, and then Hammond's doing something different. But those two things don't really connect, but they really do. Hammond understands what's going on. He writes at one point, "We are rapidly approaching the limit, that is to say, the point of saturation in our domestic markets. It is obvious, therefore, that we must either curtail the capacity of our factories, which will result in throwing out employment of millions of wage earners, or we must depend upon the exploitation of foreign markets for relief or congested home industries." And indeed, he's trying to attract capital, and he's writing back to the companies that would eventually be the Allis-Chalmers company, and he's saying to them, you can't get into this market right now. Right? They're buying exclusively from British manufacturers. I can get you in. I can provide you inroads into the South African market. And then also when we think about Hammond, sort of an exploration story here. There's also a metallurgy story here. I don't know, Corby, you might recognize the image on the right. It's from one of the readings that you gave me. So this is, This is gold production in South Africa. You can't see it very well, but 1884 is when gold is discovered. We've got on the Rand. When we think about metallurgical processes in this period, the MacArthur Forest process using cyanide to process gold ores, that's right here. And if we think about when Hammond came, 1893. Pretty good timing if you're going to come to South Africa as a mining engineer. So in this period, this is a man of exceptional timing. We see a dramatic increase in gold production in South Africa in this period, brought on in part by his expertise, but also by changes in the way that gold ores were processed, which allowed them to process gold that previously they weren't able to capture. And right over here at the end, to be relevant to the next slide, that's the Boer War starting in 1899. I said he had good timing usually, and he did until he didn't. So you can imagine, if we think about what's going on in South Africa in this period, there's a longer story, but there's tension. There's tension between the British, led by Cecil Rhodes, and mining companies that are coming in and looking at that situation and saying, we got to get this stuff out of the ground fast. The local government, the Boer government, descendants of the Dutch, who are saying, no, this is our land, and then the black African population as well. The tension was there in the 1870s, it was there in the 1880s, it was there in the early 1890s, but when it's recognized what exactly there is on the Rand in terms of production of gold, that tension goes through the roof very quickly. And the mining companies are chafing under this. And they're saying, there is no way that you can prevent us from taking this stuff out of the gold, whatever is going on in terms of government. And in 1895, there is an attempt, it's called the Jameson Raid, an attempt to overthrow the Boer government that is led by, well, we're not really sure. There's a book that came out in 2017, Onslinson, that on the cowboy capitalist, it's about Hammond. He makes the case that Hammond's sort of, western part of the United States ethos, the cowboy mentality, he brought that with him into South Africa, and he's the one who led this failed rebellion. It's an outright failure, the Jameson Raid is. I've been through Hammond's papers, and I don't see that necessarily as the case. Others have said that he just got in kind of over his head. He didn't really understand what was going on. So we're not really sure about that. There's still a lot of debate about what happened there, but what we do know is that Hammond was sentenced to death. in 1895. He was tried and convicted of trying to overthrow the Boer government. Unsurprisingly, he doesn't die. I'll give away the ending. But he eventually does. He eventually pays a fine and is free, and goes on. And this is where I'll kind of take a nod to some of his future events and perhaps the future paper. By 1903, he's working for the Guggenheim Exploration Company. He does a lot of things in the 5 years that he works for them. For one, he cashes a check for $250,000 every year, plus a share in the mines that they invested, which was good money, even at the time for sure, and even today. But right at the end of his time with the Guggenheims, right around 1907, he looks to Chile. And he's looking, there's increasing demand for copper in this period, and he suggests, you know what, there's a mine down, a potential mine. This is green exploration. This isn't a mine that's in operation at all. Greenfield exploration. There's a mine down there, a site that looks pretty promising. And that mine was the El Teniente mine, the Braden mine. And that was the way in which Kennecott eventually made its way into Chile. But that all is another story, perhaps for another time. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to move, we got a question.
How did he get out of his guest seats?
Yeah, we call it Hammond affair. It was an international incident. The United States was fixated on this idea that one of the mining was U.S. citizens had been imprisoned in South Africa. Now, very quick, there was a lot of tension there in the United States, but some people said that's not our problem. We went out there and tried to overthrow a government, which means that some hand in that, flash the United States government involved. Others said we protect our citizens when they're working abroad, and eventually the State Department does intervene to try to negotiate so I think it's money.
There are those that say if John Hayes Hammond had wanted to be president of the United States, he would have been the first mining engineer president versus Hoover. But he chose not to go down that path.
You have those aspirations, maybe a little bit of money.
Yes. So, okay, our next presenter here, I'll let you set up your screen there, Mike, while I introduce you. So, our next presenter is Mike Koss. I don't think Mike needs much introduction to anybody within the society. I've known Mike for umpteen years, but he's a retired mining engineer. He worked for the U.S. Bureau of Mines, the Office of the Secretary of the Interior, IBM, and a number of mining companies. He has a BS degree in mineral engineering, or mining engineering from Penn State, and an MS in mineral engineering from the University of Minnesota. Mike was heavily involved in our GEM activities here for years, and I didn't realize that Mike was an amateur historian until I was researching gold in North Carolina for some reason, and I came across a paper Mike had written on gold mining in North Carolina. And then I came to find out that he was the webmaster for the Mining History Association. And so I'll tie back into his presentation here whenever I do assuming somebody stays around long enough when I do my presentation after this, I'll tie back into this a little bit too in some interesting ways. So Mike.
Thanks very much, George. Yeah, this is sort of a Shaggy Dog story. In fact, 4 Shaggy Dog stories, all kind of concatenated together. I worked in Friedensville as a Penn State student in a summer job. Jumping ahead many, many years, my son becomes a Civil War reenactor in Arlington, Virginia. He's in a Confederate unit as opposed to a Yankee unit where all my relatives were Yankees. And I started studying a little bit about how the South was getting its minerals during the Civil War, and I came across the Silver Hill Mine in North Carolina that George mentioned. It was the backup mine for lead for the Confederacy. The lead mine that supplied almost all the lead for the Confederacy was in Austinville, Virginia, which was a New Jersey zinc mine in more recent history. So I started thinking, well, you know, this has got kind of an interesting story. And then I found a guy who was the superintendent of the Silver Hill mine, who's also the superintendent of this mine in the lower left corner, which is the Friedensville mine. During the Civil War, he's in 2 census records because his family's living out in Friedensville, which is 5 miles below Bethlehem. And he's down there can't get back to Pennsylvania. He's down there running what initially they thought was a silver mine, became a lead mine, and eventually became a zinc mine. And it isn't until 1865, after the war is over, that he gets back to his family at Friedensville. But I'm not going to tell you his story today. I'm going to tell you the story about the creation of the zinc industry, the real commercial zinc industry. We're going to talk about the Friedensville mines, which weren't the first zinc mines. Those are up in Sussex County, New Jersey, around Franklin and Sterling Hill. But the mine here in the lower left-hand corner is the Friedensville mine circa about 1876. On the right-hand side is the original Gilbert and Wetherell Zinc Works in Bethlehem. Lehigh University is on that hill now. Bethlehem Steel is immediately to the left as you go down the Lehigh River. And unfortunately, no remains of this plant are available to look at, just a big parking lot. So let's take a look at the industry in the mid-1850s. Here's Friedensville and Bethlehem. Here's the Franklin mines, which were mined by 3 different companies. In fact, many companies over the years. But the zinc industry, in terms of smelting and oxide manufacturing, was here in the Newark area. Exploding the map of Friedensville, you can see there's a large mine up here called the Uberoth mine, and 4 other mines: a Tri-Corner Lot mine, the Correll or Saucon mine, the old Hartman mine, and you can see a new Hartman shaft here. We're going to talk mostly about the Uberoth mine and maybe just a little bit about the new Hartman down here. The key players, I don't want to say, you could write a book on each one of these guys. In fact, several books have been written. Samuel Wetherell, for those of you that are zinc folks or have a connection with zinc, know about the Wetherell process. It was a zinc roasting process that vaporized the zinc. The zinc went into bag houses, which is another patent by a gentleman named Jones. And Wetherell was the guy that really created the zinc works in Bethlehem. But these zinc works were supplied by the mines at Friedensville, and a farmer found the mines. He found heavy rocks out in the field and took them to a fellow who became the first mineralogy professor and geology professor at Lehigh University, who identified it as what we would know as calamine, or a mixture of hemimorphite and smithsonite. So Wetherell and the fellow that discovered the mine found a person that would buy the property for him, and that fellow went on to try to lease it to the zinc smelter operators in Newark, and had no luck. They turned him down. So Wetherell quit the New Jersey Zinc Company and decided to found his own company. So that happened around 1853. Interesting thing in the Pennsylvania law at the time, you couldn't own the whole process from the mine to the product. So a second company was set up in addition to Wetherell's company, and it was a number of Quaker investors in the Philadelphia area. And they ran the mine, and they marketed the zinc oxide products. In the middle of this process flow is Wetherell with his zinc plant. Well, the investors in Philly are not too happy about Wetherell. He's a technical guy, but he's also kind of a playboy. He does a lot of horse racing, a lot of other stuff. He put together in the Civil War period. He put together his own militia group. I mean, he was quite a character. So a major hostile takeover takes place. Joseph Wharton is sent up by the Philadelphia investors. They force Wetherell out, and Wharton goes on to manage the zinc works, which is producing zinc oxide, but on the side he develops, using some of the Belgian technology, the first metallic zinc smelter in the U.S. And Wetherell, he's credited with the first large-scale zinc oxide production, and this was incredibly pure oxide. They were making zinc oxide in the Newark area, but nobody could really compete with him, and he had the patents for the oxide furnaces. So we're going to now take a quick jump down to Friedensville, 4.5 miles away, and I want you to just see the aerial view of what they were mining here. This is the Uberoth mine, which was the first and largest mine. Initially it was, oops, wrong button here. Initially it was a, well, if I can get oh, there it is. Initially it was a pit. This is where the farmers found the large nodules of zinc minerals. They did the typical thing in the day. They put them in log washers and washed the clay and the gravel off and put it in mule trains and sent it to Wetherell's smelter over the hill in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. There's a few other things here that I want to point out. Basically, we don't know exactly where the mine office in Wetherell and Wharton's day was down here, but there was an 1870s mine office building down here. But basically, what we see here is a mill building tucked into this kind of depressed area. As they dug all the ore out of the surface pit, they immediately hit bedrock about 45 feet down. And what you had here were near vertical veins. They were actually kind of bedding planes and joints and of this type, crisscrossing this limestone and dolomite. No sooner did they get down here, they knew they had to get underground. They had a good Cornish mining engineer, a guy named Richard Pascoe, who ran the mines for Wharton initially and then came back. He was the guy that ran the mines in the Civil War era. And they went underground, and they mined literally only ore minerals. They left the limestone in its place, and it was like mining a giant pile of blocks of limestone. I mean, there are pictures, and you'll see a couple of them where you have blocks of limestone held up by a few timbers, and we'll see a couple pictures of those. Later on, and I'll talk about this in just a minute, we're going to mention this smelter that was put in the late 1880s, almost at the end of the mining. And in 1872, they installed an amazing American version of a Cornish pumping engine. Water was a problem. As soon as they got down below the water table, they were always pumping water out of the pit and then out of the underground workings. So it got so bad in around 1868 or 1867 that they committed to building a gigantic pumping system. And that occupied this little square building right here, and you're going to see this, it still exists today. The bigger building is a building that ultimately held, initially they built 18 boilers to run this steam engine. I added a few more later on, but we'll see more pictures of these in a minute. So here are some pictures from stereograms from the Library of Congress of what it was like in the Uberoth mine. They're going underground on this kind of ledge here. I'm losing this right about here. Is where the mill started going up the hill. You can see they had an incline going down here for hauling waste rock out. And you can see what they called the suspended shaft. Well, there never was a shaft for men or ore at the Uberoth mine. They just kind of draped a combination of incline and then kind of almost vertical tracks that went down and dropped down ultimately to about 225 or 230 feet. The miners entered the mine on ladders, and they did this in all the mines in Friedensville up until they finally closed. So you can see what I'm talking about, the blocks. I mean, railroad car sized blocks and small blocks, and it was a pretty hazardous mining thing. And occasionally you'll see a timber here and there. And when I worked there in the 60s as a summer student, some of these mines were drained, and because New Jersey Zinc was operating their modern mine, and you could still see, it looked like cordwood timbering these veins. It was still in place after it had been underwater for about 70 years or so. So let's go and take another picture here. Here's the President pumping engine, largest steam pumping engine ever built in the United States. Just for dimensions, the bob wall here, oops, let me go back. The bob wall on the engine house that it sat in is 8 foot across here. The flywheels are 30 foot in diameter. The cylinder is 110 inches in diameter, largest ever built. And you can see the pumping rod. This is a classic wooden pumping rod, 2 feet by 3 feet, and there's 2 of them because you can see on the cross-sectional view, you can see the 2 bobs up top, and the pumping rods were going down here. The design capacity was 17,000 gallons of water a minute. Pretty impressive. It was designed by a nephew of one of the most famous Cornish engineers, John West, who did wrote the book literally on pumping engines in Cornwall. And so a lot of the story at Friedensville is about this pump. It was commissioned in 1872. It was called the President because Ulysses S. Grant was supposed to be there for the christening of the pump. However, Quakertown, about 20 miles south, there was an old Army buddy of his that lived there. They must have had a good time that night. He never showed up for the commissioning of the pump. So let's go. Now here's jumping ahead. The pump started in 1872. This is a picture around 76, we think. Interesting things happened, and I'll talk about those in a second, but you can see the pump house. The pump house is back here. It's about 50 foot on an edge around here and several stories tall. Here's the mill. Here's the suspended shaft. You can see the incline barely going up here in this old print. And there's a flume system that goes actually from a predecessor pumping plant over here. It goes across and it goes out the side of and out down into a creek on this side. The mine during this period went down to about 225 feet. The design capacity for the pump was set at 300 feet. So they never quite got down that far. But the trauma that happened here was that Wetherell's patents expired in 1876. So Lehigh Zinc, which ran pretty much everything here, closed all these mines because they could get mines or ore from the mines in Franklin, New Jersey, much cheaper, and also the companies over in Franklin and Sterling Hill could produce the zinc oxide using the expired Wetherell patents. So the pumping costs basically shut down Friedensville. And they went through a succession of owners. Most importantly was, those of you that know about New Jersey Zinc knew there was a thing called the Great Consolidation in 1898, when all the legal disputes of 200 years in Franklin, New Jersey were resolved, and New Jersey Zinc became the prime person or prime company there. And New Jersey Zinc purchased these mines in 1899. But the mines were already shut down because finally this whole competitive situation got so bad that all the mines that were still operating shut down in 1893. And within a matter of a few years, the President pump was scrapped, unfortunately. That would have been something to see. Here's what it looked like around 1910. You can see the water level is up. The mill would have sat on this little peninsula right here. There's still all foundations and things here. The pump house stone structure is still there. There's some foundations left of the boiler house. The mine office was still there. And from here on until 1947, this became the town swimming hole. Let me jump to the next one, though. This is just one picture of the Corell mine, and I throw this in here for the geologists because if you remember from the overview there of the Uberoth mine, the veins were vertical. Here, what we have is an anticline going up that's all gone on the top of the anticline, and down the other side of the district is the other part of the ore body that's sloping down at about a 45-degree angle here, it looks like. And that's becoming an open stope mining thing. So it's like the old lead belt, but tipped in an angle like this. And this is a picture that was taken right around 1893, just before all the mines were totally shut down. And you can see they have an incline system that was put in here. You can see some of the pillars. Interestingly enough, this whole scene has been backfilled. Nobody quite knows who did this, but it happened sometime probably in the maybe the mid-1900s, maybe just around the New Jersey Zinc time. But this ore body now continues west. We're looking kind of due south here. It continues west. In the waning days of the Friedensville district, in their first cycle of life, after New Jersey Zinc had bought them, they dewatered some of these mines, and they did test mining. And they did a big exploration program, actually several of them over the years, and they were looking at this extension of the ore. It wasn't vertical like the Uberath mine, but it was also a much lower grade ore. You can see this, I don't know whether this is a posed picture or not, but it's the only picture we have from the New Jersey Zinc initial test mining in 1916 and 17. Again, a Library of Congress picture. So now we jump to the 1940s. If you look at the right side of the map, right over here, you can see a property line, and that picture that we just looked at of the Corral mine is right in here. In the 90s, 1890s, the new Hartman shaft was sunk right in here. You can see the pillar systems are a little raggedy in here. And then in 1947, New Jersey Zinc decided to develop this property. It took them until 1954 when they officially opened it. Put in a huge pumping plant, did basically a pretty traditional stope and pillar operation. The rooms weren't quite as tall, the stopes weren't quite as tall as the pictures you saw from Missouri, but they were 125 feet in some places. And they benched down. This whole thing is not only tipping a bit in this direction, but it's tipping down kind of this way to the west. And the mine operated until the 1983, I think, was the closure time. Here's a couple of pictures just from the modern New Jersey Zinc Friedensville mine. The mine plan is basically still there. The head frame was gone. But you can see they didn't do trapeze mining, but they did mining off of aerial platforms. Here's one of the pumping stations underground. They had 3 stages of pumping, getting 25,000 gallons of water per minute up to the surface. And they had pretty much rubber-tired haulage toward the end of their life. They had they had a couple of IMCO loaders that were specifically designed to work on the pitch before, but they went eventually to these custom-designed trucks and front-end loaders. And then this is just kind of a summary. Basically, in today's money, the whole district produced about $3 billion worth of zinc. A lot of it in the early days when they were hand sorting and then doing jigging and these type of things. And the average initial ore that was sent to the Bethlehem plant was 45% zinc. During the New Jersey Zinc modern period, the ore averaged about 5.5 to 6.5%. But of course, it was bulk mining. Flotation was now being used, and in the end, it wasn't the lack of ore that shut them down. It was really the depressed zinc prices during the 80s. So here's just a Google Earth view of the whole district. Up here in this top, you can see the flooded Uberath mine. You can see a 4-lane highway going through here. Now that wasn't there until the 90s. You can see in yellow with all the X's, these are the 5 original historic mines, and then the outline in red here is the operation, and essentially the ore body they were mining is right in here that New Jersey Zinc ran. Their surface plant was sitting here. After New Jersey Zinc closed, And of course, you know, New Jersey Zinc aficionados know they were now part of Gulf and Western first, and then Paramount or Sony or somebody. You know, it was just this big acquisition. And when they closed the mine, a Lehigh graduate who had a very successful construction company in Harrisburg bought the whole New Jersey Zinc land package and everything that was on it. And so what you see now as the redeveloped New Jersey Zinc mine, you can see the, oops, let me go back here. Here's the original New Jersey Zinc plant. Over here we have the Penn State Lehigh Valley campus. We have a huge Aldi food warehouse. We have a golf course, which is really kind of built right on top of the mine workings and purposely not further developed. But we also have the old tailings disposal area here. We have a big shopping center here. We have a big office complex here. And urban sprawl has pretty much taken over this side of Bethlehem. Lehigh has a campus just off the screen now on this side of the mountain. And it's pretty much a fully developed area. When the mine finally closed up, they were way down here. They're following this same dip of all this trend of all these mines along here. And they were down about 1,800 foot. The shaft went down a little bit further. And they had plans to go further, but not at the price of zinc from the 1980s. So I want to just show you what's there today. Okay, here's the Uberoth Mine Cornish Pump House. This is an amazing thing. And what we're showing here is that my two co-authors are one a professor at Lehigh, one a retired citizen there, are trying to preserve this as a historic mining heritage park. And so these schematics here show what it might look like if it was a park. And inside the pump house, you can see a display mock-up of a 30-foot flywheel. You can see the flooded pit here. We know where the worker housing was back in the days when it was mostly Irish and English miners. And the pit is actually quite nice, particularly if you see it in the fall. It's beautiful with fall foliage. Why are we doing this? Lehigh University now owns this land, and we think that they will be motivated to help develop this. It's all a function of money, of course, getting grants. And so we have some of the Lehigh students in the spring of last year, in the fall, or the spring and fall of last year, they developed a concept for a mining heritage park here. And you can't really see it on this diagram, but there's hiking trails and jogging trails there. There's a bit of a pipe stem connection to another mining area that Lehigh also owns that would make a very nice jogging trail if we could extend it down there. Okay, this is where this gets tricky. We have to see if this really works. The first semester these kids were working on it, they decided, well, they found in the archives at Lafayette University, just up about 15 miles up the road from Lehigh, they found original blueprints for the President pump. So they built a SolidWorks model, digital model of this portion of the main structural components. You can see the cylinder, you can see the 30-foot flywheels, you can see the 8-foot wide bob wall and the structures on top. And what isn't shown here is, of course, you'd have the pump rods going down here. So if this works right, I'm going to show you this animation. Let's see if we can get it to work. It doesn't seem to want to come directly. Oh, wait, there it goes. Here we go. This is a very cool experiment. These kids love doing this thing. And you can see there's a stick figure in the middle of the picture. That's a human being, a 6-foot-tall human being. So this was a monster machine. The only thing that's not accurate here, of course, if you've been to a Cornish pump house, like some of the preserved ones in Cornwall, they don't make much noise. So they hadn't quite gotten that message when they built this model last spring. This fall, this was a 2-semester capstone course, and it actually had several mechanical engineers. They had several business majors that were on a multidisciplinary team that did this whole development. This year, this fall rather, they decided they wanted to make a physical model of this that they could actually have maybe at an exhibit in a museum or at a park, and they have a couple of options of where they could put this this model. But we're going to see how this might fit in the pump house here in a couple of minutes. Some of you do know that there is a World Heritage Site on Cornish mining, and it's largely centered in Cornwall, but there are, in various places around the planet other than Cornwall, preserved Cornish pump houses. The only one in the US and Canada is at Friedensville. That's this one on the left. And it's an amazing shape. The Australians, as part of their National Mining Heritage Program, have restored a number of Cornish pump houses. There are a couple in Namibia, too far for most tourists to go. There's a nice one in Mexico, and so what we're kind of hoping, the grand vision here, is that this might become a kind of a U.S. entry into this whole mix of Cornish heritage. I want to say one thing. Here's our students. This was our team in the spring. These guys and girls have done a great job, but the whole development of the history of this area has been a long process. I got involved in it early on. Mark Connor, who is the local guy there, has made it his life retirement project, and it takes a lot of people to track down a lot of information, and you can see some of the information sources there. So it's been a great project for these students. They've had to try to make a business case for it. They've had to try to look where they can get funding. They are all going to graduate this spring, so we're kind of starting to figure out if we're going to put another team together for next year. Now, if this works, I'm going to take you on a trip through a flyover, very short flyover. You can see in this picture the pump house, cyclone fence around it. It was totally covered by 100 years worth of vegetation. You can see the flooded pit in the background, and those green trees just in the far background are the top of the New Jersey Zinc tailings pond. So it's what is remarkable is what condition this place is in, considering that it was built in 1870. Here's the bob wall where the rods would have been going up and down running pumps. The only thing that's in some danger here, and you can see it in this far window, is some of these wooden lintels are 12 bys, and a few of those are in bad shape. So the first thing we do when they get a grant for this thing is we fix the lintels in the pump house. I just want to mention one other thing. On the back table, there may still be some of these. If you're interested in seeing this video in your own personal convenience, there are 3 QR codes up on the top. One is for the presentation, and the others are for the video. So please grab a sheet or come up at the end and grab one. And on the bottom of this, and George is going to talk maybe a little bit about this, but there's a little quick history of the connection of AIME, the Friedensville mines, and Lehigh University. And it all ties back to AIME's creation in 1871. So thank you.
Bear with me, people. One more paper, and I promise I'll talk quickly. Let's see. I think I was 5. Yeah. I won't even look at my notes, and that'll make me talk a little bit quicker here. But all this stuff ties together. Believe it or not, if I remember to mention things as we go through here, we'll tie to virtually every one of these presentations, with the exception of Anthony Lucas, because he's a little bit later in time versus the rest of this. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit is the founders of AIME back in 1871. As I pointed out, we'll be celebrating our 150th anniversary in 2021 in Wilkes-Barre. So this right here, the Appalachian section of SME had a historical marker put up to celebrate the 145th, and that's the marker right there on the site of the hotel, or right next to where the hotel had existed for the founding, and that's a bunch of people from TMS, SPE, SME, and AIST there for that event. Okay, so let's look back in 1871. It was a very different period of time. Population of the United States was about 39 million. There were only 37 states. Ulysses S. Grant was the president of the United States at that time. First professional baseball game was played. The Civil War had ended just a few years earlier in 1865, and Virginia, Mississippi, Texas, and Georgia had just been readmitted to the Union the year before. Transcontinental Railroad had only been finished 2 years before that. So a very different time frame. And from a mining perspective, Pennsylvania anthracite was the king. There were 8 active mining schools in the United States in 1871. Everybody talks about Freeburg, and most of your engineers went to Freeburg, but we did actually have eight active schools. Now, I'll have a list here with 9. The reason why I have 9 is the very first school in the United States, the Polytechnic College of the state of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, opened its doors in 1857, but really by about 1866 had completed its graduates in mining engineering. There are very few after that date. So the remaining schools were actually active and graduating engineers, not in very large numbers, but they were graduating mining engineers. The interesting thing about this list is none of these schools have mining engineering programs today. And I know my friends from Columbia will argue with me, but Columbia has not given an undergraduate degree in mining engineering since I think about 1996 was the last degree. So of the 8 schools that were active at the time, none of them are active in mining today. So this is the second part of the list. And you see the Ivy Leagues on that first list. You saw MIT, and you'll see Yale on here as well. The 2 that figure prominently in our discussion here are really Lafayette and Lehigh and RPI. So there was an original call for a meeting that went out in April 1871, and that was signed by Eckley Cox, and Rothwell, Richard Rothwell, and Martin Coriel, from the latter 2 from Wilkes-Barre, Eckley Cox from Jado, PA. And it was actually circulated by letter and published in periodicals, including the predecessor of American or Engineering and Mining Journal, with 2 objectives. The first being more economical production of the useful minerals and metals, and the second being greater safety and welfare of those employed. I'll talk a little bit about what the driver on that was. So Rossiter Raymond is a famous figure, and I'll come to him a little bit later on. But in June 1911, at the Wilkes-Barre meeting, he talked a little bit about what the circumstances were behind this. And this is the end of the Civil War. During the Civil War, prices had spiked for anthracite, and most of the anthracite was produced off of leased land. So you were paying a high sum to a lessor. As long as the Civil War was going on, these guys could recoup their investment. Unfortunately, they were being taken to the cleaners by the property owners, and they were having a tremendous problem. The whole focus of the property owner was produce and not necessarily economical development or sustainable development, but rather production, because they wanted their return. And so these engineers were really upset about the condition of anthracite mining, and they wanted to do something about it, and they decided the way to do it was to try to form a professional society, and that professional society would be modeled on those programs that they were aware of in England. And really the first subject that they came to the table with was the waste of anthracite. This was their driver. This is why they wanted to have to form an institution. Raymond noted that there were 3 things necessary for a professional society to be formed and mining to become an honorable and useful profession. First was some type of a journal or publication, and there were 2 at the time, Mining and Scientific Press of San Francisco and the American Journal of Mining, later to become E&MJ. You also needed technical schools. At that time, you really had Lehigh and RPI and a couple other schools. And then you needed a technical society as well. And so AIME became that venue for the technical society. So of our three organizers, we had Eckley Cox. And Eckley Cox had actually, this was a family business in the mining of anthracite. He had been educated in Paris and then went to Freiburg. You had Richard Rothwell, who had also went and been educated in Paris, was a consulting engineer, was actually teaching at Lehigh at the time. And then you had Martin Corll, who was a self-taught mining engineer, as were most of the mining engineers at that time. They really needed someone else to take this from an anthracite-centric or a Wilkes-Barre-centric society into something else. That catalyst that took this into a more national type organization was Rossiter Raymond, who at the time was editing E&MJ, not making much money at it. It was a loss leader. But he was also the U.S. Commissioner of Mining Statistics for the West. He was lecturing on mining at Lafayette. And he had tried previously to organize something called the American Mining Bureau. So Raymond was really the catalyst that made this look like more than just a Wilkes-Barre organization. So Tuesday, May 16th, 1871, they had an organizational meeting, and they had the first organizational meeting in Richard Rothwell's office at 4 p.m. It's interesting. Thomas McNair's son went through his father's diaries and did a book called With Rod in Transit, The Engineering Career of Thomas S. McNair. And McNair actually had a diary entry about this. So this is really where we get a sense of this. You don't find this published anywhere else. But according to McNair, he showed up at Rothwell's office. He was getting off the train and ran into Rothwell, and Rothwell said, "Come to my office at 4 o'clock. We're going to form a mining society." So he shows up at Rothwell's office, and Dato was the only person that was there. But they met later that day at the club room of the Wyoming Valley Hotel, which is right adjacent to where we now have the historical marker, and established a preliminary organization. They had 22 people that were there. On Wednesday morning, they did what later came to be really a theme of AIME. They did a morning excursion to Pleasant Valley mine, an anthracite mine near there. And virtually every meeting from there on out included some type of an excursion. That was part of the technology transfer. I've actually created a summary of every one of those, and it's fascinating to look at where they went, and especially when they got into the bigger events where they went by rail and steamer and traveled all over the West and places. But that evening, they permanently established the new organization and adopted the rules and almost the name of the North of England Institute of Mining Engineers. So they became the American Institute of Mining Engineers. They elected 18 officers. Only 6 of those officers were present, and they added 30 new members that hadn't attended the day before but were people that they knew had expressed interest in joining. So now we were up to 52. Then the next day they met once again, and they added 16 more members. So we actually started a society with 68 people, 22 on the first day, and then finished it out. They finished out that year with another meeting in Bethlehem with 157 members. Now, what I wanted to point out here, of the 11 of that 157 from the first year are inductees into the National Mining Hall of Fame in Leadville, which is actually pretty impressive. Of the 22 guys of that first day, three are in the Hall of Fame. Of the second day, 4 of the 30 are, and 1 of the final day. But it's still pretty impressive to have that number of people there. Now, once upon a time, we used to always say SME or AIME was founded by mining engineers. Well, then I got more involved in AIME, and I have more of an appreciation for what a mining engineer was at the time. A mining engineer and this comes right out of some of those initial documents. It comprehends engineers that are connected with mining or metallurgy. So basically, you had mining engineers, geologists, metallurgists, chemists, and all others connected or engaged in practical mining and metallurgy. And they created a category called associate member for all others, but they wound up putting everybody in the associate category for the first year. Now, of the 22 people, and I'm going to focus on the 22, although when you go through a lot of the AIME material, virtually everybody that was inducted those first 3 days was considered among the founders. But I'm just going to focus on some of those 22. 12 of them were colliery engineers, managers, or consulting engineers associated purely with anthracite. 2 of them were furnace or iron ore furnace operators associated with the early iron industry. 2 of them were Lake Superior Copper Region people, so this ties back a little bit to some of that early work that was done up in Michigan. 1 was a chemist / metallurgist, that was Thomas Braun. 1 was a professor, Stillman, and I'll get back to him. 3 were from ENMJ, so you had the press there at the very first founding. You had 3 members of the press out of 22. So, but you got to figure that the reason why ENMJ was so interested in this is they needed material to publish. Once you established a professional organization, they actually became the first venue for printing material from the meetings. This gave them material, so they had 3 representatives there. They also had 1 recent graduate who was actually working for the railroad, that was Henry Drinker, and I point him out. He had just graduated from Lehigh just right before that. Now this ties back to Mike's presentation because his graduation thesis was on the works and mines of the Lehigh Zinc Company, and that actually was one of the first publications. It was included in the first volume of publications as well. And well, I should point out, they actually read his thesis at the second Bethlehem meeting, which is why it became part of our transactions. So of that first 22, I have 1 more person I add to this. It turns out Martin Corll was there. He was one of the guys who signed the circular, but he took minutes for the first meeting, and he forgot to mark himself down as one of the first 22. So there were actually 23. You got to give Martin credit for the fact that he was there. And Rossiter Raymond noted this several times in future years, as there was actually 1 more guy there that doesn't get any credit. You can see the bulk of these guys were from either Wilkes-Barre or Pottsville or around that area, the anthracite area. And our New York contingent was obviously the guys from ENMJ. Now, the very first president was a guy who wasn't there. They elected David Thomas as the very first president of AIME. The reason why they elected David Thomas was David Thomas wasn't an academic, wasn't a consulting engineer. He was a practical guy that knew how to run furnaces. And they really were afraid to alienate members if they went ahead and made this a group of academics or engineers. And by bringing David Thomas in, they demonstrated that they really valued practical experience and they could enhance the membership for the society. So he became the first president. And during his tenure of his first year, he spent most of the first year trying to resign. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a couple of these guys just to give you a sense on who they were. Richard Rothwell actually was one of the guys who signed the original letter. I'm going to go through those 3 first. He was born in Canada, educated at Trinity College, but he went to RPI and graduated from RPI and was a consulting engineer. He was actually teaching at Lehigh, and Thomas Braun, who was the student that showed up at the meeting that was going to work for a railroad, he actually was one of Thomas Braun's, he was teaching Thomas Braun. We'll get back to that later. But, so he was considered the overseer of the department head at Lehigh at the time being. And he later became an AIME president, but very quickly thereafter he became co-editor at ENMJ and actually a co-owner of scientific publication company that owned ENMJ. So his tenure really went forward from here with ENMJ. Second one was Martin Croyle, and if you remember, he was the practical engineer. He was the tie to the copper in Lake Superior, so he was up in the Lake Superior area up there, and had done a number of, had worked up there for a number of years and had just come back to the Wilkes-Barre region. Now, Eckley Cox was probably, he was the wealthy one of the 3. His family had extensive holdings. He had been educated at the University of Pennsylvania, then had went to Paris, and then Freiburg. the thing that I wanted to point out here about him, he was actually a state senator, so he was involved in politics, a number of issues. But the Eckley Cox Village is up in outside of Wilkes-Barre, and the only remaining anthracite breaker, there is a facsimile or a model or a full-scale model built there that was used in the movie The Molly Maguires. So if you saw the movie The Molly Maguires, that's the breaker, and that breaker still sits there today. It's the only remaining breaker in the anthracite region. Now here's Rossiter Raymond. Rossiter Raymond really was the guy who pulled this all together. He became president of, as soon as Dave Thomas elected to step down from the presidency, Rossiter Raymond stepped into it. He was there in 72, 73, and 74, so he served for 3 years and then was secretary for quite a long period of time. Really, this is the man that is responsible for the fact that we're here today as SME, because he kept AIME together. You note that he has PhD from Lafayette. And the interesting thing is he continued and he actually got a degree, the very first law degree given from Lehigh University in 1906, and he's known today for the law of the apex, so if you get into all that kind of stuff, mineral law in the West, you can get to him. But the interesting thing was, right after AIME was founded, remember he was the commissioner, U.S. Commissioner for Mining Statistics, AIME was founded in May. In August, he left, July or August, he left for the West. And on part of his tour out through the West, and he took time with Ehlers, one of his associates, and they actually went to Yellowstone, and you'll see them referenced as the first tourist through Yellowstone. And this was shortly right after AIME was founded. If you can see that his career, this was one of the oratories given at his funeral, but the man was very well known. This brass piece here that shows Rossiter Raymond actually is at SME's headquarters right now. You can go into, it's mounted to one of the walls in the office. It used to sit in New York City as a remembrance of him at our offices in New York City. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about him, there's a book called Slag and the Golden Age of Lead Silver Ore about Anton Ehlers. Anton Ehlers was an associate of Rossiter Raymond's. The interesting thing about this whole book is written to show how the Guggenheims took him to the cleaners, that he was actually the source of all the Guggenheim's mines in the United States, but the Guggenheims took them to the cleaners. That's the thrust of this book. So this is just recently published, but it's available out there. It's an interesting book. So I said I'd come back to Thomas Drown. He was the, Thomas Drown was a consulting engineer in 1871. He was actually a medical doctor, graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and then had done chemistry, then did metallurgy at Freiburg, and actually came back in and served as the president in 1897 and then as the secretary for a number of years. He really is, there was a fire. They didn't have a permanent location, so because we were so tied in at the time to Lehigh, he had the records of the society there at Lehigh. There was a fire in 1879. He recovered the records of the Institute. He and his students took all this stuff out. His own personal library burned down because he cared more about the Institute's materials. So there was a donation taken up, and about 2 years later, they gave him a couple $1,000s to replace his library. I wanted to mention that he was the 4th president of Lehigh, and you'll see this tie to Lehigh. We had one other future president of Lehigh in this group, too. The other thing I wanted to mention is in 1885, he went to MIT, and he hired Ellen Swallow Richards. Now, I'm stepping away a little bit, but Ellen Swallow Richards was the first female member of AIME. And she was also the first woman graduate of MIT. She graduated in 1879, and she married Robert Richards, so we have the Robert Richards Award. She was actually his wife, but she has better known with her own accomplishments in life. So I had given a presentation to TMS at their board meeting about AIME, and I mentioned this, and they were coming at, they had scheduled a summit on diversity, so they named the summit, their very first summit on diversity, they dedicated it to Ellen Swallow Richards and wound up publishing a book, The Remarkable Life and Career of Ellen Swallow Richards, and I encourage you to read it. It's really a neat book about the first female member of AIME.
I think she's in the Hall of Fame.
Yes, she is, because Penn State, Frank Applin had been trying to get her in for a number of years, and when TMS got interested in this, and they reached out to her descendants, and she's now in the Hall of Fame, yes. Very impressive woman, but not one of the founders, but still worth mentioning. Okay, we had Henry Drinker there. Henry was born in Hong Kong, was a mining engineer and a lawyer, so he got his degree in Lehigh. If you remember, I mentioned Drinker was the one who was one of Richard Rothwell's students. Rothwell had decided he was too busy, he couldn't teach at Lehigh anymore, he left. Drinker was one of the few guys there that was a student, and they said, okay, you got to transfer into something else. You can't go into mining. He says, no, I want a mining degree. So he self-taught himself from Crook's Metallurgy. So I'll let the metallurgist appreciate that. But they let him so they let him self-teach himself out of that, and that he was able to complete his degree in mining engineering. He left and he went into the railroad business, but this is the one who did his thesis on the mines and works of Lehigh Zinc. So he actually went on to follow Down as the 5th president of Lehigh. So he replaced Down as the 5th president. And just have a picture of him that's in the Smithsonian that his sister-in-law painted. That's a man with a cat, I believe it's called. Man with a cat, yep. I wanted to throw up Joseph Herbert Bramwell here as well. He was born in Liverpool, graduated from college in New York, and then went to Berlin to study mines. He had just returned to the U.S. in 1871, just came back into the country. And he was working with Petchen, who was a Dunbar iron master, and Petchen wanted to go to this meeting and couldn't go. And he said, hey, Bramwell, I just hired you. You go to this meeting. So Bramwell actually was there as the founding and became one of the 22. And Petchen wasn't elected a member until, I think, the 2nd or 3rd day. But Bramwell's also interesting because later on he got into coal, went down into West Virginia, and I've driven through Bramwell, West Virginia many a time, as I'm sure several other people in the room here have, without appreciating that it was named after one of the founders of AIME. I threw Ernest Gajot up here. I'm only going to talk about him for a second. He was a French-born mining engineer who lived in Tamaqua, but he actually later on, at the time of his death, he was working in West Virginia for United Thacker Coal Company. I only mention him because he had 2 sons, and both of his sons received the Medal of Honor. So there's 5, I believe there's 5 sets of brothers that have received the Medal of Honor. His 2 sons were the only ones to receive a Medal of Honor in different wars. So, just interesting. I threw Julius Silliman in here. He actually was the professor. He was serving at the time as the Markle Professor of Mining Engineering and Graphics at Lafayette College at the time of the founding. But the interesting thing about him is he's a Civil War veteran, and he was captured at Gettysburg, and then actually the Confederates fled the town, and he was recovered back to his unit. And after the war, he graduated with a degree in mining engineering from RPI. The interesting, and he actually, so you can read about his letters are published, and you can read about his story during the war. Now, he wasn't, so I put him in here to also point out there was also a Confederate major, Simmons, who was actually in that group of 22. So we had the Confederates and we had the Union Army both represented in the initial 21. I threw Ward in here just simply because Ward was part of the EMJ group. He was He was a wealthy individual, but he worked as ENMJ and eventually became a co-owner of ENMJ. But he developed the manganese industry in the United States, and then moved on to gold and silver out in the West. So I threw this timeline in here just to show you what's happened to AIME over time. So it started out with 22 mining engineers, quote unquote. Now you know there was actually 23 there. They didn't have a headquarters until 1883 when they were established in New York, in space in New York, incorporated in 1904, and then it's grown since then with the Institute of Metals, Petroleum Division, Iron and Steel, and so forth. But it takes us from 1871 all the way through to today. And that's where I'm going to leave it at. I just wanted to point out that appropriately, the 50-year souvenir that they gave whenever they had a meeting in Wyoming, when they had the 50-year meeting in Wilkes-Barre, everybody got a shovel. So we're still in the hand loading days, so everybody got a shovel. So and this is that's the historic plaque that's in Wilkes-Barre. So that concludes what I have to say. I want to thank everybody for our very first mining history session. I trust you enjoyed it. I trust that if we do this next year, we'll have some people show up. So thank you for your attendance.